Interlude 11, Part 1. A howl tore through the air. It wasn't the howl one would expect from a dog. It was ragged, with a guttural undertone that hinted at the size of the one doing the howling. Before the howl had even finished, more took up the cry in answer. A second howl, then a third. More joining in, all at once. 7 or 8. Bentley raised his head and joined them, his tail wagging on his undersized hindquarters, almost prancing on the spot in his excitement. Water splashed around paws as wide around as bike tires as he landed, spraying bitch. His enthusiasm was infectious. She bared her teeth in a wide grin, then whooped, adding her voice to the cacophony. She hopped up his side, gripping ridges of hard muscle and bony growths so she could throw one leg over his other shoulder. A spike of bone scratched her upper thigh beneath her skirt, but she didn't care. It was nothing. "Go, Bentley," she urged him. He surged forward like an arrow loosed from a bow. She could feel the heat of his body underneath her, the rippling movements of his muscles as he ran. She could smell him, like dog breath and the coppery tang of blood, that faint, sweet smell of meat on the verge of going bad. She could smell herself, her body odor. She hadn't washed in 2 days, but she liked her own smell. She liked that her belongings and her place all smelled like her. It wasn't that she wouldn't take care of herself. She would, just like she took care of her dogs. Just as she groomed each of them twice a week or more, she would tend to herself. But what did some scruff on her legs matter when she was treading down flooded streets or caked in mud up to her knees half the time anyways? What did some body odor mean if she didn't even like the people who were around to be offended by it? Barker, Biter, and the others would be at the locations she had assigned them. She had given them the most menial of tasks: grooming the dogs, feeding the dogs, picking up shit, checking the dogs for sores, cuts, ear infections, and ticks like she'd showed them. She had a good number of dogs in her care now. Most had been taken from kennels that hadn't been in a state to help the animals since Leviathan attacked. She was eagerly anticipating the moment someone complained. Barker or Biter would be the ones to whine about the task first. They had powers. They had expected to be in charge, to be her lieutenants. The looks on their faces when she'd given them their tasks had made her day. Nothing like putting someone in their place. If they didn't complain by the time they were through checking and taking care of all of her dogs, maybe they would start when the next batch arrived from the shelters, and they were told they had to do all of those dogs on top of starting afresh with all the ones they had done before. The moment someone did complain, or if they let one tick, one rash, or one ear infection slip, she could make an example of them, humiliate them, scare them, insult them. If she did it well enough, they'd leave. If she did it really well, they would all leave. Then she could be alone for a while, alone with her dogs. Nobody would be able to nag her about the fact that she hadn't given the henchman thing a try. Fuck it. She already had all of the assistance she needed, the best, most loyal kind. Lucy appeared from a nearby street, making her excitement known with a noise that was half bark and half something else. She ran alongside Bentley. "Good girl." Bitch laughed. "Come on." Lucy responded by huffing out a noise that might have been a bark. Her footfall splashed out of sync with Bentley's, and they were soon joined by others. Ink, Magic, Roxy, Buddy, Bruno, and Socks. None of the others were as large as Lucy and Bentley. This would be their first run, a taste of her power. She would give them a little more each time, keep an eye out for the ones who listened, give more training to the ones who needed to be kept in line by the bigger and more obedient dogs. But this was her territory, her space. Finally, a place where she could do what she wanted. Here, she was free, and that meant she could be dirty. She could go where she wanted, hurt anyone who got in her face. She could roam free with her dogs and try her power on them without worrying about people getting hurt. Which wasn't to say that people wouldn't get hurt, of course. Just that it was her territory, and she was allowed to make the call. Anyone who hadn't gotten the message already deserved what they got. Bentley and the rest of her pack drew towards the source of the howling. Sirius stood outside an apartment block, filling the evening with that mournful, haunting sound that carried through the air. She hopped down from Bentley's back and used the back of her hand to wipe away some of the sweat mucus and blood that had transferred from his back to her inner thigh. Sirius, good boy. He wagged his tail, and the tip of it made trails in the water. Sirius, guard. She pointed toward the front door of the building. Bentley, guard. She pointed at the little emergency exit at the side. The two dogs moved to their respective positions. Sit. Her dogs all sat. She noted Magic was a little slower than the rest to obey. Would Magic have listened if the other dogs hadn't been here? If she hadn't been following along with the others? Bitch made a mental note. Stay, she ordered, drawing out the word. She could see the group of dogs freeze. She had a routine with her dogs. The first priority was making sure they were healthy. That meant grooming and possibly shaving them, getting their records and shots updated if they hadn't come from the shelter, cleaning their ears, and ensuring they were kept away from the other dogs so she could check the color and consistency of their shit and track any changes. Shit revealed a lot about the dog it came from the obvious of diet to general health to mood. An unhappy dog had unhealthy shit. The second step was training, and every dog got some dedicated attention. Sit was the first command they learned, followed closely by stay, off, fetch, and come. Depending on the dog, it could take a couple of days before they had it down solid. These commands were absolutes. If a dog didn't listen to each of those, it wasn't allowed to go out, and it didn't get any use of her power. Once a dog had those commands down, it opened the door to other orders. A dog that would stay put while she demonstrated with another would be that much more inclined to follow suit. If only humans were as reliable, as easy to train. Dogs, attack. The word was quiet, but every dog present was waiting for it. Bentley and Sirius stayed at their positions, but the rest of the dogs surged into the building, the larger ones leaping through the boarded-up windows, the smaller ones surging in the front door. Growls and barks that were twisted by the unnatural shapes of their throats overlapped into a single noise. She waited outside the building, one hand on Bentley's neck. He wanted to go. She knew it from the tension, but he was obedient. Good. This was a test for him. Another howl sounded far away, startling her. If her dogs were here with her, only one dog would be elsewhere. She listened as the howl came again. Yes, Angelica's howl reflected her size and the degree to which Bitch had used her power on her. More than Bentley, Sirius, and Lucy. She whistled for them to come back, long and loud, and her dogs came tearing back through the building. She checked, and she couldn't make out any blood that didn't belong to the dogs. Good. Better to terrorize and inflict light wounds than to maim or murder. If the people in that building stayed in her territory, she would be surprised. She climbed onto Bentley's back, then whistled twice. Come. A jerk of the chain collar around Bentley's neck and a kick to his side spurred him into action. The others followed, some yipping or barking with excitement. Did other people experience anything close to this? Did Taylor, Brian, Lisa, or Alec? She felt like she was one with Bentley as she caught quick breaths between his jarring footfalls. Water splashed onto her skin and his. Her legs pressed against his body, and she could feel the expansion and contraction as he huffed out breaths. She trusted him, and he trusted her absolutely in return. It varied from one dog to the next, but the same was true with the others that were following in Bentley's wake. They believed in her, and if they didn't love her yet, she knew it would come in time, with her patience and continued care of them. What did Lisa have that compared to that rush, this security? What did the others have? Why, Bitch wondered, are they happier than me? Unbidden, the answers came to mind. She remembered living with her mother. She couldn't even remember the woman's face, but that was little surprise. Mom had worked anywhere from 3 jobs to none, but she spent little time in the apartment. When she was home, she was either drinking in her room or partying with friends. Little Rachel's questions or attempts to get attention were met with anger, rejection. She would be pushed away or locked in her room. Better to stay quiet, watch for an opportunity. If her mother passed out drunk, bills could be taken from her wallet, secreted away for later purchases of bread, peanut butter and jam, milk and cereal, or orange juice at the corner store. If there was a party, and if she was successful in keeping from getting underfoot, she could often snatch a bag of chips, a box of ribs or chicken wings to eat under her bed or on the roof. So she got by. until the day her mother didn't come home. The food in the cupboards had disappeared, even the cans of pineapple, pears, and nuts in foul-tasting syrup that had been left behind by the apartment's previous residents. Desperate, terrified to leave the apartment in case the 15 minutes she spent looking for food were the same 15 minutes her mother stopped by, she'd turned to trying to cook the rice, standing on a chair to reach the sink and stovetop. After pouring the rice into the water that had been sitting on the hot stove, she'd accidentally brought her arm down on the arm of the pot and tipped it all over herself. In retrospect, it was a blessing that she hadn't known that the water should be boiling. Still, it was hot enough to turn her skin pink and leave her screaming enough to drive the neighbors to call 911. Then the foster homes. Home 1, where the parents were kind, but lacked the patience to deal with a little girl who Child Protective Services had labeled a borderline feral child. Her foster sister there had been a mongoloid that stole things, breaking or ruining what she couldn't take for herself. Rachel had responded the only option she could think of, attacking the girl who was 3 years older and 50 pounds heavier, leaving the girl bloody and sobbing. They found a new home for her rather quickly after that. Home 2, where the parents were not kind, and she had 4 foster siblings rather than the one. 3 years there, a long series of lessons on what she'd done to the idiot sister from the first home, taught with the roles reversed. An education in violence of every kind. Unable to keep the feelings bottled up within her, she screamed until she couldn't breathe any longer. Then she took a deep breath and screamed again. Even though she screamed until it hurt, it was tiny and insignificant compared to everything she wanted to convey. Home 3 had been the breaking point. 2 foster siblings, a single foster mother. She'd overheard her caseworker saying that the new foster mother would be a disciplinarian, the only person that might be able to turn Rachel into a civilized human being. Bitch's opinion, years later, was that this had been a retaliation, a punishment inflicted on her by the caseworker for the countless trips to school or the home to deal with Rachel. She hadn't believed that her foster mother could be more of a disciplinarian than her second set of foster parents. Realizing the nature of her situation had been unpleasant. The foster mother brooked no nonsense and had a keen eye for every failing and mistake on her children's part, quick to punish, quick to correct. If one of her children spoke with their mouths full, she would snatch that child's plate away and dispose of the contents into the trash can. Never the carrot, always sticks. Rachel was made to attend school, then after-school makeup classes, with piano every other day, as if she couldn't be bad if she didn't have the time. But Rachel hadn't been equipped for these things, would never be equipped for school or manners or piano. She fought back, challenged her foster mother's authority at every turn, and when she was punished for this, she fought back twice as hard. She might have gone insane if it wasn't for Rollo. She'd stumbled onto the mangy, hostile puppy in an alley between her after-school classes and home. After earning his trust with scraps of her lunch over the course of days and weeks, she brought him home and chained him up at the very back of the expansive backyard, out of sight of the house. She had stayed quiet when her foster mother complained about the neighbor dog's barking, feeling a confused mixture of smugness and terror every time it came up. Her lunch money went towards buying the dog scraps of food, guessing at what he needed, and this sacrifice of her lunches, coupled with the frequent lack of dinner, left her getting headaches and her stomach growling constantly during school. She would wake up at 4 a.m. to visit him and play with him, and the lack of sleep left her so tired she would drift asleep in the middle of class. But a dog couldn't be chained to a tree, not for 22 hours out of every day. She'd seen him grow increasingly agitated and unhappy to the point that she couldn't play with him without him hurting her, so she'd untied him to take him for a walk. He'd slipped free and headed for the house. Her blood running cold, she'd chased after him. When she caught up to him, she found him in the pool. She couldn't swim, and he couldn't climb out. She'd pleaded with Rollo to come out of the pool, tried to run around the pool's edge to get to him so she could pull him free, but he'd been scared and swam away from her. Then the plastic cover of the pool began to slide closed. When Rachel had looked to the house, she'd seen her foster mother standing on the other side of the sliding glass door that opened into the backyard, her finger on the switch. Slowly, gradually, despite her screams and banging on the locked door, the cover had slid over Rollo's head, trapping him. For nearly a minute, there was the bulge beneath the cover of Rollo's head as he swam in tight circles, his sounds of distress muffled. Her foster mother's punishments always matched the crimes. There could be no doubt Rachel knew the dog from her pleading and shouts, and having a dog was against the rules. Or maybe it wasn't even that. Maybe it was the fact that she was making a disturbance at 5 in the morning, or the realization that the barking that had plagued her foster mother for so long was Rachel's fault. Whatever the reason, the dog was to be disposed of, much in the same way as a plate of dinner was thrown out for holding a fork the wrong way, or sitting at the table with her legs too far apart. She'd woken to her power in that moment of panic. Fed by her power, Rollo had grown enough to tear through the cover. He'd then torn through her foster mother. The shrill screaming of her foster siblings indoors had drawn his attention, and he went after them too, pouncing on them like any excitable dog might do with a mouse or rabbit. He'd torn through door frames and walls and an entire section of the house and collapsed in on her foster family. In one fell swoop, she lost the closest thing she had to a home and family. It hadn't been perfect. It had been nightmarish at times, but she'd had so little for so long, she found herself clinging to the scraps she did have. She ran then, and she kept running for a long time after that. Her breath hitched as she drew in a breath. She shook her head violently to shake away the tears. She had stopped screaming, but her dogs were making up for it as their voices had joined hers and continued long after she'd stopped, almost drowning out Angelica's howls. So many bad memories. Memories she wished she could purge from herself, scour from her brain with fire and bleach and steel-bristled brushes. She was unhappy because humans were pack animals, she decided. Taylor and Lisa and Brian could smile and laugh because they had their pack. They had their family members and they had each other. Alec was more of a loner, but he could still joke and laugh with Brian. They had their pack, their dynamic. She wasn't really a part of it. Bitch knew that she wasn't a lone wolf by choice the way that Alec was. There was a void there, some part of her that craved that human connection because she was a human, and that's what humans needed. The way things had played out, things she had no control over, she'd never had a chance to figure out how to deal with people, how to invite them in to fill that void. Friendships and family, conversations and jokes, being close to others and knowing when to speak up and when to stay quiet. They were treacherous things, littered with complicated nuances, bad associations, and worse memories. Even if she somehow got something right, she always managed to fuck it up sooner than later. Easier to leave it alone, easier to stay back and not try. And if they got in her face, if they challenged her and didn't let her keep them at arm's length, it was easier to fall back on what worked and what she knew than it was to try to guess how to respond. Violence, threats, it earned her respect, if nothing else. Then, Taylor had made overtures at friendship. Taylor had invited herself into that place, that void, and had stayed when Bitch fucked up. The scrawny kid had stood her ground instead of running when Bitch called her out on something. And maybe just a little, in some small way, Bitch had gotten a glimpse at what she'd been missing out on, only to find out it was a ploy, an act so that Taylor could get the group's confidence. And now the others had forgiven her? So easily? She could see them fawning over the little traitor, and there was nothing she could do about it. They liked Taylor more. They would keep Taylor on the team and make Bitch leave if it came down to it. She knew it in her gut, so she'd done something stupid. She'd tried to get rid of her teammate, and she'd done it in a way that haunted her. More than anything, more than all of the people she'd hurt, the people she'd accidentally killed, or the days she'd scrounged in the trash for food when she'd been homeless, wandering the cities on her own, she hated herself for what she'd done to Taylor. She had acted like the people who haunted her memories, using what should have been a position of trust to try to hurt someone. And she didn't know what to do about it. A gunshot startled her from her thoughts. "Go," she shouted. "Go." More cracks of gunfire echoed through the night as her pack arrived on the scene. Angelica was there, her form hulking and rippling with muscle to the point that she couldn't move as fast as she otherwise might. That was fine. Angelica couldn't move as fast these days anyways. Not since fog had hurt her. She was more comfortable like this. She was big, strong, and able to move without pain. Angelica flinched and backed away as the shots came, striking her flesh. There was another shot, and Bitch saw a flash from the window, a glimpse of a face. Her face twisted with rage. "Attack!" Her voice was shrill. She leapt off Bentley's back so he could go too. "Fetch them! Fetch! Go, go!" As they'd done at the previous location, her dogs tore through the building. This time, though, they came back with people in their jaws. Arms, legs, and torsos in fanged grips. Men, women, and children. Some screamed where the dogs didn't know their own strength and bit too hard. She found the man she'd seen in the window and stalked over to him. "Fuck, fuck, fuck," the man repeated the word. "You insulting me? You trying to act big?" "What?" The man's eyes widened. Was he staring at her, challenging her? Was it a fear response? Was he rallying to fight, trying to get a wider sense of his surroundings? She could only guess. "No," he said, his eyes moving around as if searching for help. Defiance? Sarcasm? A lie? "I don't think you realize how badly you fucked yourself. You shot my dog." She looked at Angelica. Her baby wasn't acting too hurt, but he'd shot her. He could have killed her if the bullet landed in just the right place. She kicked him in the face, and his head rocked back. Blood fountained from his nose. "I didn't know," he managed, huffing out air, blood spraying at his words where it had run down to his lips. "Didn't know she was yours. She was scary. I reacted." Was he lying? She couldn't tell. She'd grown up with so many good liars. It felt like everything that sounded honest was a lie. If he was lying, and it was obvious, she'd look weak if she fell for it. Others might not get the message about this being her territory, about her dogs being off limits. If he wasn't lying, well, he'd still shot Angelica. "Nobody hurts my dogs. Please, I have a wife, kids. As if family somehow made you better than someone else?" The idea nettled Bitch. Life experience had taught her that it was all too often the opposite. People were assholes. People were monsters. The exceptions were all too rare. Far too many of those same people started a family just because they thought it was what they should do, and then they were assholes and monsters to a captive audience. She kicked him again in the stomach. He screamed as the kick made his arm, still in Ink's jaws, wrench the wrong way. "Angelica," she ordered. She kicked him in the stomach again. "Paw." Angelica stepped forward and placed one paw the breadth of a truck tire down on the man's pelvis. He howled in agony, his words rapid, desperate, and breathless. "Heavy, oh God, please stop. Please let me go, make it move, it's crushing me." She looked at him with distaste. It bothered her that the only time she could be absolutely sure what someone meant, what someone wanted, was in circumstances like this. "Angelica," she ordered, ducking beneath Angelica's outstretched limb, kicking him in the kneecap. "Take it." Angelica bent and gripped the man's legs in her teeth, twisting his body further. His body was pressed to the ground by her paw, his arm and legs pulled up and away from it. She stepped close to Angelica, burying her face in the slick muscle and hard tissues that layered the dog, wrapping her arms as far as they would go around Angelica's shoulders and neck. Just as her dogs came to trust her as she cared for them, fed them, and nurtured them, she grew closer to them as they shared experiences with her, as they learned and accepted their training. Angelica was one of the dogs she was closest to, the only dog she was this close to. Brutus and Judas had passed, the only dogs she had been with for years. Her heart broke a little every time she thought about it. And this man? This family man? He'd thought he could take Angelica away from her. Without looking at him, her head still pressed to Angelica's neck, she gave the order, "Hurt him." She felt the vibration rattle through Angelica's head and neck as bones snapped and crunched between her teeth. The man shrieked. There was no better word for it, and others in the vicinity echoed his shrieks with their own. She gave the hand signal and an order. "Drop him! Dogs, drop them!" Angelica let the man drop. His shins were cracked, the ends of his legs bent at odd angles. One by one, the other captives were dropped to the ground. Each of the man's noises of pain was a little smaller and quicker than the last. "Why can't you fuckers get it through your skulls?" she called out. "This is my territory." "We didn't know," someone said. A woman who was clutching a bloody arm to her chest, her daughter beside her. "You fucking challenging me on this?" "No, no. We just, how are we supposed to know? Are you retarded or something?" "It's obvious." Bitch couldn't believe the woman's stupidity. "How are we supposed to know?" The woman raised her voice, sounding plaintive. "The howling. If you can hear the howling, you're too fucking close. Leave. You could probably hear that halfway across the city." "No fucking shit," Bitch retorted. The woman was challenging her authority. She had to respond to it, or the woman would keep talking. Bitch would say or do something that made her look stupid, and others would stand up to her. Best to stop that sooner than later. "Socks, come!" The woman shrank back, clutching her daughter, as Socks advanced to Bitch's side. "Stop," a voice ordered. Bitch turned and saw two capes. From New Wave, weren't they? Brandish and Glory Girl. Brandish spoke. "Glory Girl, call your sister. At least one of those people needs medical attention, fast." She stopped as Bitch whistled as hard as she could. Barking and snarling, her masked dogs charged the heroes. After being ambushed and taken captive by the ABB, she'd learned her lesson. Hit first, assess the situation later. Besides, what was she going to do? Talk to them? Brandish flicked her hands out, and beams of light drew into vague sword shapes. As the dogs stampeded towards her, she flicked them out to double the length. They drew closer, almost reaching her, and she reconsidered, banishing the weapons to condense herself into a beach ball-sized ball of orange-yellow light. The dogs hit her. There was a spray of sparks, and the ball was sent careening down the street and through the wall of a building. Glory Girl was flying over the stampeding dogs, a cell phone pressed to her ear, in Bitch's general direction. Ink and Bruno leaped to the side of a building, and then leaped from that point toward Glory Girl. She struck Socks across the head, sending him flying to the ground, and Bruno slammed into her, knocking the phone from her grip. She brought her knee up into the dog's side and pushed herself away before he could drive her down into the ground. The heroine went for Bitch, who had only Angelica at her side. Angelica positioned herself between enemy and master, and Glory Girl hit the dog broadside. Angelica barely reacted, turning instead to snap at Glory Girl. Her teeth rebounded off the heroine's outstretched arm, and Glory Girl darted backward to hover in the air. Catching her breath, watching the situation, that wasn't how you were supposed to fight. Bitch whistled hard, then shouted, "Magic, Lucy, Roxy, come!" As the three dogs barreled toward her, she used her power. She felt it extend outward like a vibration from deep inside her. She felt that power shudder and reverberate, as if to let her know it was making contact with them. She could see the effect, could see them grow larger, see bone and muscle swell and shift. Attack! In moments, Glory Girl was contending with four dogs. Angelica advanced implacably, Bitch following at a walking pace. The other three were attacking from every direction, cutting off escape routes, leaping onto the side of the building, leaping down, running behind her, or flanking her from the sides. "Mom!" Glory Girl shouted, a note of panic in her voice. "Run!" Brandish called out her response. She was facing much the same situation, unable to attack with the relentless pressure the dogs were putting on her. Instead, she changed herself into that ball form where she couldn't be touched or hurt, flying away with every hit she took, or controlling the direction so she could make her way for an escape route. She managed to find enough pause to lash out at one dog and shout, "Get the wounded!" Glory Girl caught Roxy around the snout as the dog lunged for her and threw her down at Lucy. She used the momentary reprieve this granted her to fly straight for the man who'd shot at Angelica, who lay in a heap on the ground. She stopped mid-flight. A woman stood over the man's mangled body, her long hair blowing slightly in the wind. Which seemed wrong. With the light rain, her hair should have been wetter. Glory Girl looked over her shoulder to see the dogs, looked back to the injured man and the woman, and then flew straight up, disappearing into the gloom of the night sky. She'd left him behind. The barking and snarling ceased as the fight drew to a close. Each of the dogs returned, and Bitch noted a few injuries. A shattered plate of bone here, a gouge where Brandish's blades had made contact there. Surface damage. It was only the damage that penetrated deep past the layers her power applied, which risked hurting the dogs or doing permanent damage. Nothing so serious. Bitch breathed a sigh of relief. She stalked forward, her dogs joining her to form a loose circle around the woman. The crazy bitch was naked from head to toe, and her skin and hair were painted in alternating stripes of white and black, like a zebra. No, paint would have washed off, and dye wouldn't be so crisp around the edges. It was a natural coloring. When the woman looked up at Bitch, her eyes were yellow and bright, reflecting the ambient light like the eyes of a dog or cat might. She smiled, and there wasn't a trace of tension in her body, as though she'd just woken up in a safe place. "Who the fuck are you?" The woman didn't reply. She crouched down beside the man, then shifted her position, so she was sitting sideways, her legs stretched out beside her. Her fingertips traced the man's injuries, almost lovingly. "Answer me," Bitch ordered. The woman reached over and pressed her index and middle fingers to the man's eyes. Pressing down, she penetrated the orbs, sliding her fingers down until they were 2 knuckles deep. "Hey, fuck off!" The woman removed the fingers. Vitreous fluids and blood flowed from the open wounds in the man's eye sockets. The woman turned towards her. She didn't meet Bitch's eyes, instead looking down at Bitch's feet. It struck Bitch that the woman was making herself small, was being inoffensive. It made her feel better, strangely. Slightly calmer, her words measured, she called out, "I'm going to ask you again. Who the fuck are you?" "Siberian," the woman spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, barely audible. "What the hell are you doing here? This is my territory." "I'll leave soon. I just wanted to talk." Again the whisper. "Talking, always talking. Not interested. Go." Siberian looked down at the man, who was still writhing and twitching, making small noises of pain. "Go!" she shouted. The woman didn't budge. Bitch glanced at her dogs to see who was the biggest, the least injured. "Lucy! Lucy! Attack!" Lucy pounced on Siberian. Bitch saw Siberian stretch out her arm, saw Lucy's jaws clamp down on the limb. There was no reaction. Lucy tugged, the full force of her body behind the movement, and the woman didn't move a hair. With great care, Siberian stood. She looked at Lucy, her bright eyes roving over the dog's face and the length of the dog's body. "Beautiful," she whispered. She pressed her lips against Lucy's nose in a kiss, as if uncaring that the dog had seized her arm between jaws that could crush a motorcycle. Lucy snorted in response. Then she looked at Bitch. This time, she made eye contact, and despite her whisper, there was no nonsense in her tone. "Your dog lets go of me now, or she gets hurt." The confidence in the tone, the authority, the fact that the woman's eyes didn't waver in the slightest, they made it abundantly clear to Bitch that the woman was telling the truth. She was certain enough about it that it was worth weakening her position here. "Lucy, off, come." Lucy let go and backed off, moving to Bitch's side. "They're beautiful," Siberian whispered, looking at the dogs. Bitch nodded mutely in response. Siberian approached her, walking with a great deal of care. There was grace in her movement, and she walked on her tiptoes, each foot carefully placed a measured distance in front of the other. Her eyes shone through the curtain of her white and black hair. Bitch felt a moment's trepidation. "What?" She regretted opening her mouth the instant she did, but it was already too late. "Do you want?" "You. I don't understand." She tried to inject more confidence into her answer. "They told me I should pick someone they can test. I read about you. I heard about you. I want you on our team." Team? She hated the short answers that were coming out of her mouth, the way that they were uncertain, and they put her on weaker footing. The woman's response carried over the flooded street, through the growls that slowly ratcheted up from the dogs as the stranger approached their owner. "The 9. We have only 8, not enough. So some of us are picking people. Then we test them. I picked you, and I like what I've seen. I've been watching you for weeks now." She smiled again. "Has to be a lie," Bitch thought. Her dogs would have noticed someone following her, wouldn't they? The woman was only a few paces away. The question was, should Bitch retreat and put herself in an even weaker position, or did she stand her ground? She stood her ground. The woman stepped closer, within arm's reach, then another 2 paces, until her chest pressed against Bitch's body. She met the woman's gaze, unflinching, until Siberian wrapped her arms around her, holding her close, resting her chin on Bitch's shoulder. "Aren't you tired of pretending?" the woman whispered in her ear. "What?" Bitch tried to pull away so she could ask the woman the question to her face, but the limbs were unmoving, more resisting than steel bars would have been. "Acting like one of them, playing and losing their games, decorating yourself in their clothing and their symbols, following their rules?" Bitch paused. "Don't know what you're talking about." The pause was telling. She knew it was telling. The woman understood her. She knew. The woman understood her. The thought clicked. The way the woman moved, her body language, everything. She was making sense to Bitch in a way that so few people did. The idea left Bitch shaken. How? Why? Was it some power? From the start, she'd known what the woman wanted to express as easily as she did with her dogs. "You're an animal, Bitch." The woman gave special treatment to that last word. Bitch stiffened. The woman pulled away, one hand remaining to caress the side of Bitch's face. Her eyes were lowered again, Bitch noted. She was smiling lightly, her lips pressed together, teeth hidden, playful, gentle. Bitch let herself relax. It hadn't been meant as an insult. The body contact was intrusive, but she could grit her teeth and bear it, at least until she figured out who this person was and how she could fight back. "We're all animals," Siberian murmured. She walked over to Bentley, and Bitch hurried to give the dog the hand gesture for stay, then off before the woman moved to touch him. "Some more than others. You and I, more than others." "Philosophy shit?" Siberian smiled, her hands tracing Bentley's snout, the exposed muscles and horns. "Philosophy shit. Yes, touche, an idea given meaning because people think it should have meaning. But it's just words, isn't it?" "Sure. Join me. Stop pretending to be like them. You know you're bad at it." "I'm fine where I am." The woman smiled, her eyes lowered. She clasped her hands together and pressed them to her chin, squishing her breasts up against her chest. She turned, taking in the neighborhood, assessing Bitch's territory. "Maybe for now. You have freedom to run, to do as you like. It's nice, but you're going to chafe at it sooner or later. You're going to realize that you're still in a cage they made. You're still following their rules in the end." Bitch looked around the empty, flooded streets as Siberian was doing. She didn't answer. "Maybe you can be happy like this. A dog, collar around your neck, a fenced-in territory. You'll never really understand what they're all talking about. The best you can hope for is a pat on the head when you're good, when you do as you should, maybe some companionship whenever you're a good girl. But maybe that's what you want. As opposed to what? Being wild. Being free. Truly free. It's exhilarating," Siberian breathed. Bitch frowned. Words that sounded nice, but that was all they were. Just words. "I'm going to give you 2 presents, Bitch," Siberian whispered. "One will be waiting for you when you go back to your, what do you call it?" Bitch didn't answer. "Let's call it your den. I like that." Siberian closed the distance to Bitch with a surprising speed, her steps less controlled, carrying her long distances forward as she zigzagged over the flooded street. Before Bitch could react, or before the dogs could step in, she was next to Bitch, stopping. Siberian put a hand on her collarbone. Bitch was lifted into the air and pushed down into the water, soaked, landing hard enough that the air was forced out of her lungs. As she struggled to breathe, Siberian whispered, "The second gift is special, a treasure for a kindred spirit." Bitch coughed, struggled, but she couldn't move the hand. "As of this moment, you're the only one to hear me speak and live afterwards." She kissed Bitch on the forehead, like a mother would with a child. Bitch tried to twist away, and only succeeded in getting water in her eyes and nose. She sputtered as she struggled to draw air into her empty lungs. When she could see again, Siberian was gone. Her dogs were looking up at a nearby rooftop. Shaken, she gestured for Bentley to come to her and climbed up onto his shoulders. Coughing, snorting water from her nostrils, she gave the order, "Home." Her thoughts were chaotic as she rode Bentley down the streets, a dull roar of too many things all at once, all too important to be ignored. At the same time, she didn't want to think about them, didn't want to put those pieces together, because she wasn't sure she liked where they would lead. The gift Siberian left her. Some of her henchmen were at her den. More important, some of her dogs were there. Every minute the trip took left her more worried. She hopped off Bentley as they arrived at the building, shoving the doors open. Blood. trails leading to Barker and Biter, who were on the ground floor, unconscious, still breathing. One of the girls, the one with veterinary training that Coyle had sent to her, was sitting in one corner, nursing an arm that dangled at the wrong angle from the elbow, sobbing. This was recent. Siberian had done this in the time it took Bitch to get here. More blood, one of the boys, a dog groomer with years of experience, lying beside the kitchen counter, his shirt wadded up and pressed to his face. Around the shirt, she could see the 4 parallel tracks where Siberian's fingernails had left gouges running across his face. None of the dogs were hurt. She had to double-check them to see. Most were cowering in the corners. Some had retreated up the stairs. The blood had a pattern to it, as though Siberian had painted a picture with the spray. A line drawing from each of the injured to the center of the room, where a box sat, faintly dusted with flecks of blood. She was nervous as she opened it, but she couldn't not. A furry bundle tried to escape, and she stopped it. It bit for her fingers. She pulled her hand back, gripped it by the throat, and forced it down to the ground, making her dominance clear. A husky puppy? No. The physical makeup was wrong. The smaller ears, longer limbs, and markings around the jowls and muzzle. A wolf pup. Where had Siberian found this? There was a card in the bottom of the box, stained with urine. Bitch picked it up with the very tip of her finger and thumb. She'd never properly learned how to read, so she had to work out the individual sounds, moving her lips to try to piece it together. Ah, you have that letter. She didn't recognize it. After it was ol wolf. She gave up. She could guess anyways. Are you a wolf or are you a dog? The rule was to call Coyle at a time like this, to let him know what had happened. She found her phone in one of her jacket pockets and she fumbled with the keypad to find him in her contacts. Her finger hovered over the button. What was she holding on to? Who was she protecting? Her friends? Were they really her friends? It wasn't that she wanted to betray them. She wasn't about to repeat that mistake. But she couldn't articulate the thought. But it was Taylor's face that flashed into her mind's eye when she put the phone away. Maybe she would see what this test was about. She wasn't about to back down. But in the end, she'd make the call about where she went and what she did. You, she told the man with the gouges in his face, go to a doctor. Take anyone here that needs it. But I don't want you telling Coyle. I don't want you using his doctors. Got it? The man looked up at her, staring for long seconds. Finally, he nodded. She didn't know if he would, or if he'd be able to hide it, but if he did inform Coyle, it would at least be an excuse to get rid of him and the others. She looked down at the wolf pup, who was still struggling to bite at her fingers. She let it go, waited until it tried to attack her again, and pushed it down onto its side once more. Little bastard, she smiled. Almost without thinking about it, she used her power, just the smallest amount. She felt almost none of the vibrations or shudder she experienced as a visceral feedback on her power with the other dogs. It was only when she saw his skin splitting that she realized it was actually working. Faster, quicker, with so little of the temporary exhaustion she so often experienced on her end. Was it easier with him? What did that mean? Interlude 11, Part 2. Theo clutched the remote control in both hands. For 5 minutes, he hadn't taken his eyes off the TV set. For those same 5 minutes, the TV set had been off. Who's a pretty baby? Who's a pretty little girl? You are! Yes, you are! Aster squawked in one of the little cries that foretold an incoming tantrum. Theo clutched the remote control tighter. He felt a throbbing pain where the corners of the remote bit into the heels of his hands. Oh, don't cry, don't cry. Theo's throat was dry. Every thud of his heartbeat seemed to make his hands shake and his vision waver. He'd never been more intimately familiar with the television itself. The shape and color of the TV set, the proportion of the screen to the outer frame, the little border of silver around the very edges, and the starry brand name logo at the very bottom. He suspected it would be ingrained in his memory for the rest of his life, which might just be a very short span of time. Nope, don't see the appeal. Hey, boy. Theo's heart leaped in his chest. He tore his eyes from the television and looked up at the man who was cradling Aster. The baby needs to be changed. Theo nodded and stood. He was reaching for Aster when the man threw the baby at him. He had to scramble to catch her, almost let her slip through his arms, and only just barely caught her by pressing her against his stomach and pelvis. She started screaming, "Don't drop her now, or I'll be very annoyed." Theo nodded, raising his voice to be heard over Aster's shrieks. "Yes, sir." "Must you keep calling me that? Do I really look like a sir?" Theo looked at the 30-something man. He wore a dress shirt that was open to show his muscled chest and stomach, and had the sleeves rolled up to expose his forearms. His tight jeans were low-slung, his limbs long, and his hair was longer and greasy. The man's beard had been trimmed, but scruff was growing in around the edges, obscuring the intricate pattern that had been trimmed into the inside border of the facial hair. A knife danced around his fingers constantly, making Theo flinch every time the blade turned to point toward him and Aster. Jack Slash. "My father told me I should address my betters as sir, sir." Jack laughed with the slightest touch of derision. "Well, your daddy taught you well, didn't he?" True enough. Theo wondered if this measure of respect played any part in why Jack had let him live this long. "Yes, sir." "I'm going to go change the baby." "Yes, do." Theo's hands shook as he adjusted his grip on Aster, hauling her up until her head was at his shoulder, even though that meant she was screaming in his ear. He carried her to the changing table and set her down. Caden had reclaimed her old apartment after the catastrophe, found many of her possessions still there. The man never let the front door out of his sight as he walked around the living room, and was soon behind Theo. With the open window, Theo could hope the man was upwind of the aromatic diaper. How long before the squealing of the baby, an offensive smell, or something else set the psychopath off? How long until your mother gets back? That was something else. That was the third time Jack had asked the question. Was his captor's patience running out? "She's not my mother." Theo changed the topic. He dropped Aster's dirty diaper into the bin. Jack walked up to Theo until he was just behind the boy, his shadow cast long by the setting sun, stretching over Theo and the changing table. Theo could feel the tension ratcheting up. "I'm going to get upset if you lie to me." Theo didn't take his eyes off the baby, forced his fingers to keep working on the diaper. "Caden is Aster's mother, sir, my dad's ex-wife. She's been taking care of me since my father died." Of course, now I understand. I believe you," Jack said before chuckling. He turned and walked away, leaving Theo breathing out a shuddering sigh of relief. When Jack spoke again, there was no humor in his tone. "Do you love her, the mother of that baby?" "Yes, sir, but I don't like her." Good. Does she love you?" "No, sir, but she likes me." "Oh," Jack drew out the sound, and it was vaguely mocking. "Do tell." I take care of Aster for her. I do my chores. I don't talk back. I don't make life harder for her," Theo began. He swallowed. "But my dad treated her badly, and I think she sees him when she looks at me, and she'll never let herself love me because of that. She has to look past the doughy face to see dad in me, past the baby fat I never seemed to lose, but I have his genes. I look like him, beneath it all. Do you have some of your father in you? Did he?" "I'd like to think not, sir." "I'm remembering now. Kaiser. His name in costume was Kaiser. I met him once, don't you know?" "I didn't know." "Years ago. Allfather still ruled Empire 88 then. They held a big meeting between all of the factions. We stopped by. Great fun. I don't think they accomplished a thing that day. We provoked a bidding war instead. Group called the Teeth wound up hiring us to kill some members of the Protectorate team. We did it, and then we wiped out the Teeth before leaving the city. The Slaughterhouse 9 must have been new then. People today would know better, hopefully." Jack chuckled lightly. "I digress. I do remember your father. He was older than you are now when I saw him. He talked in a way that made me think he was an athlete." "He was, sir," Theo confirmed, "and he was disappointed I never followed in his footsteps. There were more teams in this city then, more villains. Not many heroes. Lots of scary motherfuckers around, and yet I could probably count on one hand the people who made eye contact with me. Even then, when my reputation was a fraction of what it is today. Your father was one of those people. Ballsy fucker." "Maybe he thought you'd respect him for it, sir. He was always good at reading people and making them do what he wanted, even me." "Is that so?" I'd like to think I'm much the same, a people reader, but my interest is in the design of people. What makes them tick? What holds them together? All too often, it's one little thing. In architecture, they call it a keystone, the one stone that keeps the entire arch from collapsing, the weak point. And I'm very, very good at finding those weak points. Can you guess what I'm talking about here? Why I'm in this apartment? Astor, sir? And you say you're nothing like your father. You're sharp, little boy. Theo couldn't see Jack move, but again the man's shadow fell over him. He felt himself shrink down, as if the shadow weighed on him. Thank you, sir, he managed. Yes. See, my compatriots are all busy with a task tonight, you understand. I bet on the wrong horse. Come. Jack's hand fell on Theo's shoulder and he flinched. Still, he scooped Astor up and followed as Jack led him to the front of the apartment. There was a trail of blood leading from the front door to the nearby bathroom. Jack gave Theo a push on the shoulder, but remained outside the bathroom, where he could watch the front door. Theo entered. There was a man in the bathtub. He'd seen Jack drag the man inside, had heard the taps running. What he hadn't expected was for the man to be alive. The bathwater was crimson, and the man lay in a sea of things that had been taken from the freezer and dropped within. He was Japanese, Theo noted, his hair cut short, his body bearing the lean muscle of someone who'd honed their body into a weapon, and he was unconscious, though breathing. Oni Lee, Jack spoke from outside the bathroom. Our habit is to nominate a certain individual. Then the others test them in their own ways. If that individual passes the test, they are recruited to the Slaughterhouse Nine. Theo didn't know how to respond, so he kept his mouth shut. He rocked Astor in his arms, using one hand to shield her eyes from the scene. Not that he thought she could make it out or understand what she was looking at, but it made him feel better. I had a little conversation with Oni Lee, found him living above a grocer's, with the help of one of my teammates. Someone shot out his kneecap, it seems, and he's been restless ever since. A few kills here and there, but perhaps a little harder when you can't walk. Need the right time, the right place. I kind of respected that, and the fact that he was another fan of knives was a point in my book. Yes, sir. But we didn't even make it to the test. I told him we had tinkers that could fix him up. He was interested. Then I told him he'd have to prove himself. He asked me how. Now, it isn't always done that a member of the Nine tests their own candidates, but I decided to anyways. Something off about him, wanted to make sure he didn't embarrass me. Told him to come up with something, and he couldn't. Do you know what tabula rasa is, boy? No, sir. Blank slate, a piece of paper with nothing on it, a formatted computer, a tombstone without the name on it. Seems that fellow can copy his body just fine when he teleports, but something in his mind gets left behind. Once I realized it, picked up on the fact that he was little more than a robot wanting his orders, I informed him I had decided we had no need for his services. We fought, and here we are. I see. And Jack was in one piece, while Oni Lee was bleeding out into the bathtub. So, come on out of the bathroom now. Jack ushered Theo out of the bathroom with the dying man. There we go. Back to the subject of purity in the baby, Astor? Yes, Astor, sir. We're going to play a little game. See, the moment Purity steps in that front door, I give her just a moment to take in the scene. And then snicker snack, you and the baby die. Theo felt his blood run cold. Tears appeared in the corners of his eyes. I'm going to die. I'll get to savor the expression on her face as she watches her keystone crumble. I'll get to see how she responds as that element in her life that supports everything else bleeds out on this nice white carpet. Maybe say something to just twist the knife. Jack mimed a lunging stab and then slow turn of his blade. Straightening, Jack looked Theo over. A pity she doesn't love you, but if she likes you at least, then it'll have to do. Why did I tell him that? She'll kill you, sir, Theo said. Then he added a hurried, no offense. Jack waved him off. She'll try. So many have, and they've all failed so far. But it's good that it's a little dangerous, a little risky. It's no fun if I know how it's going to play out. Some unpredictability. It gives spice to life. Maybe I'll kill her right after I see the look on her face. Maybe I'll escape and leave her to wallow in her misery. Escape? From a 15-story apartment building against a supervillain who can fly and level city blocks? Then again, Jack had done worse things than murder the child of a cape like Purity, and he was still here. Sometimes, Jack started, pausing as if he was constructing the thought as he spoke it, I like to imagine the impact I've made on the world. What possible realities am I pruning? What events am I setting in motion each time I take a life? If the flap of a butterfly's wing can alter the course of a hurricane, what am I doing when I take a human life? The life of a person who interacts with dozens of people every day, who would have a career, romance, children? Tears ran down Theo's face. He clutched Aster tight. Can you tell me who you are, Kaiser's boy? What am I doing to reality when I open you up from cock to chin and let your entrails spill onto the floor? I don't know, Theo said, his voice quiet. Don't shut down on me now. Here, I'll make you a deal. If you give me a good answer, I'll make it quick. Thrust my knife right through the center of your brain. It'll be like flicking a light switch. You just stop, and there'll be no pain. It'll be as dignified as death can be. Theo shook his head. I'll even let you relieve yourself in the bathroom beforehand so you don't shit yourself so badly when you drop dead. You'd have to be quick, unless you want to be on the toilet when she comes in, but it's a chance few get. I wanted to be a superhero, Theo blurted. Jack laughed abruptly enough that Aster was spooked and started screaming louder. His laughs continued for several long seconds. Theo went on, as if Jack were still listening. I'm probably going to get powers because I'm Kaiser's son. But I don't want to be a member of Purity's group. I don't want to cleanse the world or try to fix things by killing or through hate, sir. And you'd fight people like me, I suppose? Theo nodded. Jack was still grinning. What would you do to people like me then? Let's say you got powers. Would you right wrongs, lecture school children on doing what's right, and see bad guys like me carted off to the birdcage? Somehow, knowing the inevitability of his own death gave him a measure of courage he had never had before. Even so, it took all of the willpower he had. Theo met Jack's eyes for the first time. The man's eyes were a very pale blue, and there were lines at the corners. Theo swallowed the lump in his throat. People like you? I'd kill, sir. Jack broke into a second spell of hysterical laughter, and it was all Theo could do to keep Aster from squirming out of his grasp in her distress. Can't. Jack had to break off to let another small laugh pass. Can't say I can imagine that, boy. You as one of the vigilantes? Neither can I, Theo thought, but he remained silent. But you've piqued my interest, and if there's any reason I do what I do, it's because I find it interesting. Theo could see the cell phone on the coffee table in the living room light up and shift position as it vibrated. It happened behind Jack, and the man didn't appear to see or hear it. The only person who called Theo's phone was Caden, and she'd been out getting groceries. It was routine for her to call for him to open the lobby door, then come down to help bringing them up from the lobby. She was coming up. He was almost positive. Could he distract Jack and give Caden the opportunity to put the man down? I've changed my mind, Jack said. Theo stared, trying to fathom what the man was saying. Don't let it be said that I can't delay my gratification. Listen carefully now. I'm making you a deal. Theo nodded, mute. I want to see this picture you paint, so I'm going to give you a chance to make this happen. Theo nodded slowly, but his thoughts were on Caden's approach. How long until Caden opened the door? Would Jack attack her, attack Aster, despite what he was saying now? Or would Caden attack him and provoke something? How old are you? 14, 15, 15, sir, Theo said. Hurry up, finish before she comes. 2 years then. 2 years to get your powers, to train, to do whatever it takes to become the motherfucking badass you describe. That should be long enough without risking that one of us gets offed by bad luck or picking the wrong fight. At that 2-year mark, you hunt me down, you kill, disable, or sneak past my 9, whoever they are 2 years from now, you look me in the eyes, and then you try to kill me. If you fail, if you cannot find me, if you chicken out, what's a good consequence? In his hurry to resolve this before the door opened, Theo made the first suggestion that came to mind. You kill me. That goes without saying. No, it should be meaningful. What's your name, boy? Theo. 15-year-old Theo. How many people's lives will you touch in these coming 2 years because I've spared your life? 200? 500? 1,000? How far will the flaps of your butterfly wings extend? Theo glanced at the phone. It glowed and moved again. Was Caden in the lobby? Jack went on. If you fail in this, I'll kill 999 people in your name. I'll even break my usual rules to get the body count that high, so it's something special beyond my usual habits. Maybe a bomb, maybe poison. I'll come up with something. I can target the people you love, those you're closest to, people you've affected. Aster there can be the 999th, and you'll be the 1000th. Perfect. Canceling out the impact you've made in the world, it's poetic. Theo swallowed. 1,000 people? Could he say no? Could he refuse the offer? Or would Jack carry what he threatened regardless? Well, Jack spoke, smiling, I'll be off. He stepped into the bathroom, turning away from the door for the second time in his entire visit. When he emerged from the bathroom, he held the naked form of Oni Lee over one shoulder, a knife in his free hand. A treat for a teammate, this is. Jack winked. Doesn't need to be alive, just fresh. Would you get the door, Theo? Theo hurried forward to open the door, shifting Aster in his arms to open it. Cadence stood on the other side, groceries in hand. Stern, she said. Theo, I called you twice. Can you go down to the lobby and get the last 2 bags of grok? She fell silent as the door opened wider, revealing Jack. In a moment, the bags in her arms were tumbling to the ground, and her hair, eyes, and hands were glowing with blinding light. Caden. Theo had to control his voice to keep it from shaking. Let him go. I had a wonderful conversation with young Theo here, Jack spoke. He rested his hand on top of Theo's head. Theo could feel the hard handle of the knife tap against his scalp. Very interesting. What are you? Caden started, her voice rising with anger, but Theo lunged forward, gripping her shirt and shaking his head. She looked down, confused. Jack waggled a finger at her. Don't bother, Purity. See, I've been studying you. I go into every possible fight armed with knowledge. You have a weakness, a flaw in that power of yours. Theo could see Caden tense, but she obliged when he pushed her away from the door and towards the end of the hallway furthest from the stairwell, stepping back. While reading up on you, I tried to put the newspaper clippings and online information in chronological order, and a funny thing happened. Seems like your power is weaker some days, stronger on others. I mapped it out. You have some form of internal battery or fuel that drives your power. After going days without using your power, you're stronger. After periods where there's more sunlight, your power is stronger. You absorb light of any kind, I suppose, and later spend it to use your abilities. Theo thought he might have seen a tiny flash of concern on Caden's face. It's been an overcast week, and you've been using your powers a great deal, trying to put the pure on the map. So think very hard about what you want to do next. Because if I'm right and your power is spent, you might not succeed in killing me. And I would retaliate by killing all 3 of you. You're underestimating me, Caden spoke, her voice hard. Then blast me away. Turn me into a smear in your hallway. If you think you're strong enough, quicker with your light than I am with a knife. Prove me wrong. Jack smiled. He waited a few seconds, and the only noises in the hallway were Aster's mewling complaints. Jack stepped into the hallway and turned toward the stairwell. Thought so. Be grateful. That boy is the only reason you and your daughter are alive right now. He'll explain. Train him. Make him strong. Make him vicious. Let him take whatever path he needs to take. You and your daughter owe him that. Caden looked down at Theo, who glanced at Jack for just a second, then looked up at her and nodded quickly, urging her. Jack wouldn't be doing this if he didn't think he could get away. All right, she spoke. Jack didn't offer anything further. His knife twirling in his fingers, he stepped toward the door by the elevators, kicked it open, and stepped inside. As he made his way down, he whistled a merry tune, the sound echoing through the stairwell until the moment the doors shut. Theo handed Aster to her mother. He felt dazed at the magnitude of what faced him. 2 years. Interlude 11. Part 3. Spitfire had often complained that having a power based around creating flame meant you faced 2 kinds of opponents. There were the people who burned, who were the majority. Civilians fell into this category. Unless the person with the power was immoral, which Spitfire wasn't, this actually wound up being a detriment because of the easy possibility of life-altering injuries, death, and scars. The kind of thing that brought heroes down on the villain's head in full force. The second group was the foes who didn't burn. People in armored suits with enough covering, people with force fields, people with foreign materials either forming or surrounding their bodies. The list wound up being fairly long. Spitfire, run! Faultline ordered. Burnscar wore a red dress and had chosen to go barefoot rather than wear shoes. Her dark brown hair was a tangled mess above staring green eyes. Her skin was pale, giving a greater contrast to the red of her clothing and the circles under her eyes. The round scars of what were likely cigarette burns formed individual rows down from the bottom of each eye to her jaw. She strode forward through the flames she'd set on the streets outside Faultline's now deserted nightclub, Palanquin. Sweeping her arms to either side, she spread the flames along the breadth of the road, drew the heat into her palms, and then hurled it at her opponents. Burnscar didn't seem to have the same reservations about incinerating more vulnerable enemies that Spitfire did. Gregor the Snail caught one fireball with a hurled glob of slime, extinguishing it. The other landed in the middle of the group, not striking anyone, but nonetheless driving them apart. Neuter was at one side of the resulting blaze in the middle of the street, Faultline and Shamrock at the other, with Gregor and Spitfire at the back, furthest from Burnscar. Spitfire turned to run, and Burnscar drew together another fireball, lobbing it forward where it soared high in the air before it began to drop. The fireball collided with Spitfire, smashing the girl to the ground. Flames licked off of her fireproof suit and the pavement around her, and it was long seconds before she was able to start pulling herself to her feet. Burnscar drew fire up around herself, blinding the others, and in a moment, she was beside Spitfire, clutching the girl's throat with her fingertips, pushing her down against the ground that was still burning with traces of the fireball's heat. Why couldn't this be one of the areas where the streets were flooded? Why did Palanquin have to be on this hill? "Get her!" Faultline shouted. Shamrock drew her gun and fired, and Gregor launched a stream of slime toward the spot where Burnscar crouched. The slime put out the flame where it landed, and in the moment the splashing slime and the billowing smoke obscured her, Burnscar disappeared. There, Burnscar had emerged from a patch of flames 15 feet from Spitfire and was striding toward the girl, ensuring Spitfire was in the way of any potential attacks from the rest of Faultline's crew. She seized Spitfire and began dragging her toward an alley, one hand around her throat. Wherever Burnscar stepped, she left burning footprints, and the flames slowly swelled and spread to join with one another, a trail of fire forming a path behind her. Neuter lunged forward, leaping over the flame that separated him from Gregor, and then hopping to the nearest building to grab a bag of trash with his tail. Twisting his entire body, he whipped the bag at Burnscar. It struck her, and she staggered back, losing hold of Spitfire. Burnscar dropped into the flames that covered the pavement and emerged from the flames just behind the others. Elle, from the second-floor room of Palanquin, banged on the window, trying to alert her comrades. Like a flamethrower, twin streams of fire shot from Burnscar's hands, striking Shamrock, Faultline, and Gregor. Catching sight of the attack at the last second, Gregor did his best to shield Faultline and Shamrock with his bulk. Neuter threw more trash and rubble towards Burnscar, and succeeded in interrupting her assault on his teammates. Faultline was on fire, her costume alight. Gregor slimed her to put it out, then wheeled on Burnscar. The same instant he turned towards her, the flame around her flared up, consuming her. They turned to look for her, simultaneously trying to back away from the flames that spread with each of Burnscar's attacks, and they missed seeing the crouching form in their midst. Only Elle, from her higher vantage point, was able to see Burnscar. To say that Faultline and her crew were friends wasn't meaningful enough. Elle saw them as family, and she was helpless to do anything to save them. Her power was available to her, but the range was too small. She needed time to soak it into an area, and she'd gone for a walk earlier. 2 hours since she'd gotten back, and her power was limited to her room, the neighboring rooms, the upstairs hallway, and the exterior walls of the building that surrounded these areas. Not enough to reach the street where the fighting was happening. And if she moved beyond the boundaries, she would be losing ground. Anytime she moved to a new place beyond the limits of where her power was taking effect, her area of influence shrunk to a few feet around her, only to start gradually bleeding out once more, faster with each passing minute. She tried using it anyways. Closing her eyes, she reached for the other worlds, pocket worlds, as she interpreted them. Realities that were a blank canvas to be altered according to her thoughts, both conscious and unconscious. They were lucid dreams that were big enough, detailed enough, intricate enough to swallow her up, as they so often did. She could make new ones at a whim, but she found it better to build on what she already had. There was the High Temple. Faultline and the hypnotist they'd hired had talked her through it, building a place that wasn't so influenced by Elle's negative thoughts and ideas. It was a place she associated with personal triumphs, with her inner strengths. At the opposite end of the coin was also the bad place. Of the worlds, it was the biggest by far. Nothing she could use there, she knew. She was intimately familiar with every aspect of it. She had spent a long time there. Her eyes snapped open as explosion erupted in the street. She saw Faultline, Gregor, and Shamrock tumbling through the air. Elle clutched her arms to her body. The lonely hallways. No. The burning towers. Definitely no. The barren ruins. She'd almost forgotten. It had been her first attempt at making a world outside of the bad place. It had worked up until the moment negativity and self-loathing crept in through the cracks, filling in details where she didn't want them. Ugly details. What had resulted was a beautiful, solemn landscape, rigged with traps and pitfalls, as if the landscape itself was eager to hurt or kill anyone who didn't watch their step. As she focused on that world, a small part of her consciousness flew over the landscapes, an image in a second mind's eye. Fields of tall grass, collapsed walls half covered in moss, the remnants of an old castle, a stone hut with a tree growing out of it. She'd always had a soft spot for things that had once been beautiful, but had transformed into a different kind of beauty as they aged. She liked the look of a tree that had grown to splendor and then died, the statue worn by years of hard rain. This was the aesthetic that had shaped the ruins, until everything turned ugly, unpredictable, and dangerous. Today was a good day. She'd exhausted herself earlier in the week by taking on the merchants on what she could easily mark as a bad day. It seemed she was veering to the other side of things. She'd eaten, gone for a walk, even ventured to have a conversation with Faultline. She could only do those things because her mind's eye, the gate to those other worlds, was nearly closed right now. The drawback was that this also meant that the use of her power was slow, as though she were looking through a spyglass, trying to find a distant detail she could only take in one scene at a time. She found what she wanted, an age-worn statue of a woman in a toga, holding a large urn. Focusing on it, she pushed. It was agonizing. Not the use of her power, that was easy, unavoidable. Even on a good day like today, her power worked without her asking for it. The floor under her feet was turning into a stone tile, grass and moss growing in the cracks, as if the ruins were leaking into the real world. It was agonizing because the emergence of the statue was slow. Brick folded out of the way as it appeared from within the outside wall of palanquin. It slid forth at a glacial pace of a quarter-inch every second, and it wasn't small. The fire had spread across the street and to the wall of the building opposite palanquin. Burnscar was using it to travel great distances at a moment's notice, simultaneously spreading the flames further with every attack or spare moment she had. Neuter was quick enough to avoid her attacks while hurling objects at her to attempt to distract and batter her, but he couldn't approach to make contact with her and knock her out without her burning him. And his range of movement was quickly narrowing as the fire spread. Not only were new patches of flame created when she attacked, but she frequently paused to will the existing fires to swell and extend further in every direction. Gregor was hurt, but he was trying to control the spread of the flames while protecting Faultline and Shamrock. His skin glistened, which made Elle think he was covering himself in something that would protect him from being burned. Her power was still so slow, Only half of the statue had emerged. Not enough. She needed the entire thing. Burnscar had noticed the statue and paused to pelt it with fireballs. Elle winced as the head broke free, felt a momentary despair as one arm shattered, but the rest was intact. Just 2 or 3 minutes. Gregor caught Burnscar with a stream of slime, and the young woman disappeared in a swirl of fire. Burnscar had appeared just behind Gregor, Shamrock and Faultline. Before they could notice and react, she drew a ball of flame into a condensed point between her hands and released it in a violent explosion of heated air. "No!" Elle screamed, banging on the window. Faultline wasn't moving, and Elle couldn't quite tell through the smoke that covered the street, but she might be burned. Gregor wasn't moving either, and he lay in a patch of fire. However fireproof the slime he'd coated himself in might be, he wasn't immune to being roasted. Shamrock was limping away, limping towards the statue, and Neuter was evading a fresh series of attacks from Burnscar. Only Spitfire was largely untouched, helpless to do anything against an opponent that was not only fireproof, but who could walk through fires as easily as anyone else might use a doorway to move from one room to the next. This wasn't right. Her team, her friends, her family were all moments away from being obliterated. She had to focus. The statue wasn't enough. She needed a mechanism. The one that was attached to the statue in her mind's eye didn't work. Something else. She searched. A portcullis with a wheel, no, too rusted, the chain too prone to snapping. Ah, there. A math puzzle where a ball was set to roll down a series of tubes, with its path being determined by a series of levers, each moving a paddle that would adjust the ball's route. So frustrating. On her worst days, the days when her view of the other worlds was so expansive that she could barely register the real world, she didn't have to put things together like this. She could shape things as she made them come into the real world, and they emerged as quickly as she wanted them. Fitting everything into the statue, she had to use some of the math puzzle, the lever, some of the statue's existing mechanism, positioning it all so that they fit together as she pushed it into existence. A fireball caught Neuter in the stomach. He was knocked from where he clung to the wall, falling to the ground. He had to roll out of a patch of ground that was licked by orange flame. Burnscar turned to Shamrock, who was waiting for the liver to emerge. A fireball was flung at the red-haired woman, who ducked too slowly. The flame clipped her in the shoulder in its route to punch a hole in the wall, directly where the liver was. Pieces of the mechanism tumbled around Shamrock, gears, levers, paddles, and fragments of the switch. "No," Elle shouted, "no!" Her effort had been for nothing. Could she cobble something else together? Would it matter? Their opponent had an idea of what Ella wanted to do. She wasn't going to offer the opportunity. The last piece of the math puzzle emerged within the brick walls of Palanquin. 2 inches across in diameter, the ball fell along its set route, rolling down a slight slope, dropping through one spot where the paddle was pointing down, landing on the next slope, rolling in the opposite direction over 2 paddles. Elle grabbed her chair and shattered her window. Gripping the sides of the window, ignoring the glass that bit into her fingers, she screamed, "Shamrock!" Both Shamrock and Burnscar looked up at her. She slapped the wall with her hand, leaving bloody fingerprints where the glass had cut her. "The ball needs to go right." Burnscar launched another fireball at Shamrock, and Shamrock leaped to one side. "What ball?" Elle couldn't tell her, not without letting Burnscar know. She could feel the ball making its way down the last slope, dropping down the far left to where the mechanism and the lower half of the puzzle had been devastated by Burnscar's fireball. Shamrock would get a glimpse of the ball through the hole in the wall as it dropped down. Now, Elle felt the almost imperceptible influence of Shamrock's power. The woman was telekinetic and clairvoyant on the smallest of scales, capable of making small changes and knowing how to use them to make big things happen. The ball moved a few millimeters to the left, hit a splinter of wood, and bounced toward the right, spinning. It landed, and the spin of its rotation, coupled with the help of an additional nudge, carried the ball to the right and down into the chamber behind the statue. There was a rumble, and water began pouring from the stump of one arm and the urn the statue held. It poured down around Shamrock, flooding out onto the street to quench the fires on the ground level. Soon it was only the patches of flame on the walls that remained. Shamrock raised her gun, aiming at Burnscar, and fired. Once, twice. It was hard to tell if the shots hit home, because Burnscar was already wreathing herself in flame, disappearing to appear from the burning wall near a Spitfire. Spitfire ran, and Burnscar chased her. Elle could see Shamrock hesitate, then leap through the curtain of water that poured from the urn, giving chase, hoping to help her teammate. "No," Elle shouted, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of the water. Soon the pair were gone. Her phone. She needed to phone them, let them know. Where was it? In the kitchen. Stupid. She'd been in one of her momentary fugues when they'd been gathering dinner. She had to have left it there. And if she ventured any further than the upstairs hallway, maybe the ledge above the dance floor, she would be losing any ground she'd gained with her power here. A horn, some kind of noisemaker. A bell. There was a bell in one area of the barren ruins, if she could only find it. Burnscar dropped from the burning wall opposite Palanquin. Retracing her steps, she looked up at the window that Elle stood behind. She's not after Spitfire. She's after me, Elle thought, with a moment's despair. Burnscar trudged through the expanding pool of water to enter Palanquin's front door. The club was empty. There was no power, no music. Even the employees were attending to their personal lives. It was just Elle and Burnscar. It was a minute before the door to her bedroom opened. "There you are," Burnscar said. Elle looked away. "Hello, old friend," Burnscar said. She wasn't good at talking, even on a good day. "Mimi." "Long time." Elle nodded. I'm sorry about your friends. I didn't come here planning to do that. It's just, you know." Elle nodded, trying to keep her outrage off her face. I'm really sorry, you know. I can't help it." "You can. You just don't try hard enough." But Elle didn't voice her thoughts. She nodded. "I don't think I did any permanent damage. They're alive." "Thank you," Elle managed. She couldn't entirely suppress the bitterness in her voice. Burnscar didn't seem to notice. I wanted to talk, like old times." Old times. Elle couldn't help it. Her thoughts turned to the bad place, the biggest of her worlds, the world she had spent the most time. Back when we were both having our good days, we'd talk, and I really liked those times. I look back on them fondly, one of the few moments I treasure. Elle nodded. Behind Burnscar, the door to her room was changing to metal. A tiny window was expanding, bars already closing down like teeth. The wall around the door was growing tatters of cloth that rippled like they were blowing in the wind. "Fuck," Burnscar said. "I don't even know where to start. Since I learned you were in this city, and the group wanted to come here, I've been looking forward to this, seeing you again, but now I don't know what to say." "The weather?" Elle tried, lightly joking. The wrong thing to say. "I don't want to talk about the weather." Burnscar snapped the words in a mixture of desperation and anger. Her eyes flashed orange and flame flared around her hands. Then it all faded. "Sorry. How are you? How have you been since you escaped?" Been good. Good people. So hard to articulate my thoughts, even on a good day. They take care of me. Faultline helped more than any doctor I've had." "The doctors?" Burnscar scowled. "You? Did you know I escaped at the same time you did?" Elle shook her head. "I did, but I had no place to go. I had some bad days. I was lonely, scared. Some guy tried to convince me to be his whore, earn some cash, get fed. I refused, but he kept coming after me. Sorry. I really wanted to be good. I'd told myself I wouldn't use my power, but I had to protect myself. You understand?" Elle nodded. The cloth around the door had started to settle into a shape. Padded walls, lined with barbed wire and jagged rows of glass. There were stains of shit and blood on some of the cloth, now growing and swelling. She tried to will it to stop, to focus on her high temple, her safe place. But looking at Burnscar, that place felt so far away. It was out of her reach. Burnscar went on, "So I used it to scare him off. But you know how it works. You know what happens with my power." "I remember. The doctors say that using my power, it adjusts the chemical balances and connections in my brain. Empathy, impulse control, my emotions, they disappear as I use my power, and I can't help using my power if there's fire nearby. It snowballs, because I use my power more when I don't have that self-control, when I don't care about the people I'm near, and when I'm in that headspace, I don't want to leave it." "Yeah." and you retreat into that state to avoid facing the guilt over things you've done. You use it to hide from your own fears. If I blame you for anything, it's for that. Burnscar shook her head. If you hadn't put out most of the fire out there, I don't know what I would have done. I have a pretty good idea. So I burned the pimp to scare him. Then I burned him to hurt him, for payback over his hounding me. And then I couldn't really stop myself. I burned him to death. Fuck, that was the start of a bad few weeks. Sorry. Before I knew it, the Slaughterhouse Nine had found me. Shatterbird recruited me, and now I'm stuck. I'm trapped. You know there's a kill order out on me? If I try to quit, either the Nine or the cops will off me. So I keep going. I work for them, and it all just gets worse. Surrender? Go to the birdcage? They'd find me. You don't even know what these guys are capable of. Our newest member, she replaced Hatchet Face, though he's still around. Kind of. She can find people. There's no place secure enough to keep me safe until they took me to the birdcage. I almost think they'd be able to get me in there if they wanted to. Siberian? She'd be able to get me. Even in the birdcage, she always gets her prey. I can't keep hurting people, Mimi. I have to. I can just use my power. Stay in that headspace where I don't feel bad, where I act the way the Nine expect me to. The bad place was intruding on the room further. Elle spoke up. Mimi, can I touch you? Anchor you? Don't want my power to hurt you. So you want to keep me out of your world? Mimi smiled and shook her head. No way. Half the reason I came here was because I heard you were making beautiful things these days. I have to see it, the things you can make now. Then she turned and looked around. Her face fell as she saw the padded walls, the bed that had become a cot, the shit stains, the blood, the needles in the corner, the broken glass and the razor blades that were embedded in every surface, waiting to catch anyone unsuspecting that put their hand or foot in the wrong place. No, Burnscar said. Elle tensed. Sorry. Burnscar's face fell. This isn't beautiful. I remember this. Would show you the others, if I could. Burnscar's voice was choked. But you can't, because I remind you of the asylum. I remind you of the bad times, the times you were most miserable. Elle looked down at her feet, swallowed past the lump in her throat. I thought we were friends. We had our moments, didn't we? Only a few times, when we were both allowed out of our cells, when we were having good days. A few jokes, stories. I mean, I know that some of the time I was coming off a bad spell, so maybe I snapped, or I called you names, or threatened you. Burnscar trailed off. Elle stayed silent. It wasn't, Burnscar stuttered. Her eyes flashed orange. Did you see me as a friend? Don't you dare lie to me. Elle couldn't come up with a reply. They used me as an enticement to get you to cooperate. Oh, fuck me, I'm sorry, Burnscar said. She turned away, fumbled with the metal door. Elle realized it had locked, adjusted things to allow it to open. Burnscar pulled it open, then stopped in the doorway. Her back turned, the girl said, I'm sorry about your friends. I really hope they're okay. I do too. I'm glad you're doing well. I hope I didn't fuck everything up. It took a bit of courage, but Elle hurried to cross the room and wrap her arms around Burnscar, hugging her from behind. We had some good times, Elle lied. Take care. Burnscar pulled away and Elle let the girl go. She saw Burnscar find the door to the indoor balcony that overlooked the dance floor, heard her run down the stairs. Elle sank down against the wall, pushing away the sharp things that would cut her with the use of her power. She put her head in her hands and closed her eyes to the sights around her. She'd wait a few minutes. She'd take a few minutes wait until she could be sure Burnscar was gone. Then she would leave to check on the others. It would be weeks before she had made up for the ground she had just lost, in terms of her mental health, in pushing past the bad memories and the bad place. She reassured herself with the thought that she would get better in time. She'd gotten there once. She could get there again. If the others were okay. As for Burnscar, there would be no helping that girl. Interlude 11, Part 4. There was a faint tapping sound, a clink of something hard on metal or glass. It came again, a second later. Colin looked up from his computer. Ears peeled, he turned his head to the left and waited. Clink. He turned his head the other way in the hopes of pinpointing the source. He heard a scraping noise, then the sound once more. He couldn't say where it came from. He opened an instant message window on his computer and sent a message. "You have a sec?" Guild, reading the most monotonous data on seismic activity and Behemoth's possible movements. Ugly code. "Distract me, I beg you." Hearing something. "Can you listen in?" A few seconds passed, then it came again. "I hear it. Wait, changing the settings on your microphones so I can triangulate the source." As casually as he was able, he glanced towards the window. Tinted glass, bulletproof, and reinforced with a low-degree force field. It would be easier for someone else to go through the wall than the window, but he couldn't see through walls. Nothing outdoors. Just an overcast sky hiding the majority of the moon, and a faint drizzle of rain. No person or animal, nothing else. Clink. Guild vent, behind and above you. He whirled around, grabbing the model of his nano-branch disintegration weapon from the stand on his desk. It was miniaturized, a mere pocket knife that Piggott could use for demonstration. Still, it would serve better than any chair or tool he might pick up. He briefly debated going for the helmet with the link back to his old suit's combat analyzer, but it wasn't set up. It would cost him precious seconds, 20 or 30, before he connected to the main server. Until that happened, the helmet would only render him blind. A blank display. Something moved in the gloom behind the vent. There was a flash of something white or light gray, and the vent rattled, a puff of dust flowing down where the screws held it in place. Again, there was the sound. Clink. The vent exploded from the wall with enough force to fly across the room and embed in the opposite wall. It was hard to make out in the cloud of plaster dust, but Colin saw a hand, all white, each joint segmented, fingers splayed, palm facing the room. The hand tipped forward and then dropped to the floor alongside the attached forearm, a length of chain stretching from the vent to the elbow. Other body parts followed, each separated from the rest, encased in a white shell. An upper arm, two halves of a torso, then a head. The rest of the body followed, flowing to the ground like a liquid to pool there. The right arm and the left leg were separate, detached, with only ball joints at the end. Colin noted that the flat expanse that would join the left side of the chest to the right had a clear pain to it. Organs were inside, cut cleanly down the middle, and they pulsed with activity, throbbing wet against the glass or glass substitute. There was technology in there too, regulators and filtration systems, and other gear that was designed to fit into the gaps between the most vital systems. Weapons, tools. He knew this one from the briefings. Mannequin, the realization of what he was up against, spurred him to action, pushed him beyond that momentary paralysis that came with the grim sight of the internal organs. While Mannequin was incapacitated, he charged, clicking a switch on the handle of his knife to activate the disintegration effect. A static gray cloud formed around the knife. Colin was 2 paces away when a telescoping blade speared out from Mannequin's hand, straight at him. It was luck as much as reflexes that let him stop his run, his feet sliding on the smooth ground, before he ran into the weapon. He dropped onto his back, instinctively rolling with the fall to reduce the impact. The blade snapped back into Mannequin's hand with enough force that the hand and forearm it was attached to recoiled from the impact. It flipped into the air, and the blade snapped out again to impale the top of the door frame. The chain retracted with a faint whir, and the forearm snapped into place on the upper arm, which soon connected to the shoulder of the torso. The chain joining the 2 halves of the torso together reeled in and locked into place by way of some unseen mechanism, the seam between them almost invisible. Colin felt a faint tug from his weapon as some electromagnetics kicked into effect. The unattached arm and leg flew to the shoulder and pelvis and snapped into place. The head was the last thing to join the tall, thin body. The chain slowly reeled it in, dragging the head along the floor, lifting it off the ground. It swung, bouncing off one leg, the stomach, then the shoulder before it finally connected to the neck, the very top of the head scraping the ceiling. There were no eye holes, no ear holes, nor any vents for air intake. There was only a head as white and smooth as an eggshell, with shallow indents where the eyes and mouth should be and a small bump for the nose. Mannequin raised one hand and placed it on the top of his head. With a sharp twist, he snapped it into place with an audible click. He tested the range of motion, tilting it forward, backward to either side, then spinning it around 360 degrees. "Dragon," Colin whispered, "are you getting this?" "Help is on the way, Colin." The whole room was outfitted with speakers, microphones, and micro cameras. Her voice came from the speaker directly behind him, so quiet that he would have thought he imagined it if he didn't know her. Mannequin tested the rest of his body, while Colin slowly climbed to his feet. Every joint was too flexible and was capable of moving in every angle. For a moment, Mannequin's fingers were like worms, each knuckle bending in impossible directions. Was the killer hoping to intimidate him? Nobody would test these mechanics in front of an enemy, so this was most likely a demonstration. 4 blades sprang from Mannequin's left forearm. The limb began to rotate, slowly at first, then faster, until the 4 blades were whirling like a helicopter propeller. Colin tensed, preparing to jump the moment the limb shot towards him. He'd never wanted his suit so badly. The propeller-like whirl of the blades gave the arm some buoyancy, and it shifted enough to come into contact with Mannequin's leg. All at once, it ricocheted, shearing through the computer, bouncing violently off of Mannequin's head, then his leg again, the desk, then his arm. Colin watched every movement of the bouncing blades, waiting for the moment it would fly free, or the second Mannequin charged. There would be no dodging that unscathed. But Mannequin didn't move. The spinning slowed, and the whirling blades settled into a rhythmic bounce against Mannequin's leg until it had stopped entirely, the arm swinging gently. The blades retracted. Mannequin didn't speak. He made no sound. Long moments passed. "Talk to me, dragon," he murmured. His voice shook just a touch. Any second now, Mannequin would cut to the chase and attack, and he could die at this monster's hands. Her voice was quiet behind him. As much as anything, it helped keep him calm. Mannequin, original name Alan Graham. Tinker, originally went by the name Sphere. Specialty is in biomes, terraforming and ecosystems, or it was. Colin nodded slowly. He knew this, but it was reassuring to get a recap. He became newsworthy when he took on a project to build self-sustaining biospheres on the moon. He had ideas on solving world hunger and building aquatic cities near cities plagued by overcrowding, and he was putting it all into effect, until... "The Seamerg," Colin finished. His wife and children were killed in the attack, years of work ruined. Everything fell apart. He went mad. He cut himself off from the rest of the world, literally sealed himself away. Colin looked at the cases that surrounded each individual body part a self-contained system, everything non-essential stripped away and replaced. Her voice was even quieter than before as she said, "He has a body count, Colin. You know." She trailed off, unwilling to finish. "I know," he finished for her. Like other serial killers, Mannequin favored certain types of people as victims. His prey of choice included rogues, those individuals seeking to make a profit from their abilities, especially those looking to better the world, and tinkers. Mannequin swayed slightly on the spot. Like a doll with a broken neck joint, his head flopped onto one side until it was perpendicular to the floor. There was a click as he slowly righted it. "What do you want, monster?" Colin growled. "Little point in coming after me. I don't have much of a life to look forward to. I've already lost everything." Mannequin didn't move. "You'd be doing me a fucking favor," Colin shouted. "Come on, come get me, you freak." There wasn't a movement or sound from the killer. There was a sound from Dragon, in a tone that was afflicted with agonizing disappointment. Like a mother who had just found out her son had been arrested for a felony, she said, "Oh, Colin." Colin didn't speak. He waited for elaboration. "The PRT got a tip from one of the villain teams. The Slaughterhouse 9 is in town. So I gathered. They ran it by some of the experts. Colin, the consensus they came to was that Slaughterhouse 9 are in Brockton Bay to replace their 9th member." He stared at Mannequin, and the realization made his blood run cold. "Me?" he shouted. The faceless man cocked his head to one side. Colin roared, "I'm a fucking soldier. I made a call that could have saved millions of lives. Billions. You're 10 times as fucked up as I thought you were if you think I belong in your group." Uncaring or oblivious to the outburst, Mannequin turned and examined the ruined computer. He picked up a key that had been thrown off the ruined keyboard and turned it over in his fingers. "Listen to me, you psychopath." "Colin," Dragon's voice hissed from the speaker, not as quiet as it had been. "Don't provoke him. Help is nearly there." Colin had to stop to control his breathing, and he bit his tongue to keep from saying anything further. His enemy had to have heard her, but didn't seem to care. Mannequin fished through the broken keys from the keyboard, found another, and folded one finger back to pin it against the back of his hand. He ejected a blade from his wrist and used it to scrape the letters that were still intact off the board. They clattered to the desktop, and a few fell to the floor. The featureless white head swiveled one way, then the other. After a long moment, one arm dropped to the floor, the chain going slack. The hand crawled over to pick up another key, then the arm reeled in. Colin tensed as Mannequin approached, backing up as far as he was able. The window was just behind him now, and he could almost imagine the crackling of the rainwater vaporizing against the force field. The villain turned and placed the keys down on the edge of Colin's desk. The first key was the letter U. 6 inches away, Mannequin put down an M, sideways. He corrected it so it was upright. Directly beside it, the villain put down an E. He stepped away from the desk and faced Colin once more. "You? Me?" Colin asked. Mannequin cocked his head. "Is this a riddle?" Mannequin swiveled his upper body to face the other direction and reached for the shattered monitor. He picked out a piece of glass and a piece of glossy black plastic. Pressing them together, he raised it to the right side of his face, looking down at Colin. Slowly, Mannequin changed the angle of the shard of glass with the black backing. It took 2 long seconds before the villain's intent became clear. Colin tensed, and Mannequin froze, fixing the angle of the shard. With the black backing, the glass reflected an image. With the angle Mannequin had carefully found, the image reflected was half of Colin's own face, overlapping with Mannequin's head. "No," Colin muttered. "Quiet," Dragon's voice whispered from the nearby speaker. "They're in the building. They'll be there to help you in 2 minutes, maybe less. I can see them on the security cameras." "I'm nothing like you," Colin screamed at the villain. Mannequin stared at him with the shallow, empty eye sockets. "I didn't date. I didn't have kids, because I wanted to be out there, helping. I knew that any attachments could be used against me, so I went without. I was fucking smart enough to do that." "Colin," Dragon pleaded. Her voice was louder. The villain didn't move. "Fucking answer me. Spell the fucking words with keys if you have to." He roared the words at the mad tinker. Mannequin swayed slightly, then righted himself with a sudden, jerky motion, as if he'd collapse into a heap if he wasn't careful. He used his hand to shift his back into place with an audible click. Colin went on. "I was out there every day, helping. I took steps to fight evil and take down criminals every day. Small steps, baby steps." "Colin, stop, please." Dragon's words didn't matter. He was going to die anyways. He'd known the moment he recognized Mannequin. He'd go down fighting, hurt this motherfucker the only ways he could. "You want to compare us, freak? Maybe we both had bad days. Days where nothing went right, days where we were too slow, too stupid, too weak, unprepared, or tired. Days we'll look back on for the rest of our fucking miserable lives, wondering what we would have done different, what we could have done better, how things could have played out. The difference between us is that I actually did something with my life, and I'm still trying to do more while I serve my sentence." He stopped and took a breath. "You started your big projects, got every fucking person in the world to get their hopes up, and then you failed to finish anything because you couldn't hack it when your fucking family got killed. You insult their fucking memories every motherfucking second you exist like this." Mannequin slammed him into the wall with more strength than he might have expected the artificial body to have. The blade came next, springing from Mannequin's hand to pierce the shoulder that led to Colin's stump of an arm and stick through the wall behind him. The villain withdrew the hand, then punched the blade into Colin's stomach. Once, twice, 3 times. Dragon's scream came from every speaker in the room. A slash of the blade caught Colin across the face, blinding him in one eye and tearing through the bridge of his nose. None of it hurt as much as it felt like it should have. More serious wounds didn't tend to, odd as it was. Colin tried to laugh and found he couldn't. He could feel blood flowing into his mouth and throat through the gaping wound in his face. He let his head hang forward so the blood could mostly flow out of his mouth. He tried to move forward, lunge with his knife, but he couldn't pull his shoulder from the wall, even though the blade was no longer pinning him there. Was it a lack of physical strength or something mechanical, flesh and bone shoved into the hole in the wall? Couldn't lapse into that kind of thinking. Still had the knife. One hole in the self-contained systems that were one of Mannequin's vital body parts would cause a leak of fluids, an introduction of pathogens that Mannequin surely wouldn't be able to fight off. He tried to speak, but there was too much blood in his mouth, and he only managed to start coughing violently, spraying blood on the white of Mannequin's chest. His vision was getting hazy. He wouldn't be able to distract the lunatic with words while he acted. He could only pray. Don't do it for me, God. I probably don't deserve the chance. Do it for every soul this motherfucker would kill from here on out if I fail. He thrust out the knife, swept it towards his opponent's chest cavity. His hand stopped, with his vision in his good eye failing him. It took him a second to see why. Mannequin's hand gripped his wrist. He pushed as if he could beat this monster in strength. By some miracle, his hand moved a fraction closer to his enemy's chest. He redoubled his efforts, and it moved still closer. A blade stuck out of Mannequin's upper arm, near the elbow joint. The upper arm fired like a small rocket to stick in the wall, and for a second, there was slack in the chain. Colin thrust the knife forward, came within inches of making contact with Mannequin's chest before the chain reeled in and the metal links went rigid. The chain started to gradually reel in, and Mannequin started pulling his hand backward toward the wall where the section of arm had stuck. Then, as if to taunt Colin, Mannequin dropped to a crouch, moved his face less than an inch from the blur that marked the edge of the blade's effect. No, he couldn't say where, but he found some reserve of strength. The knife inched closer, hairs away. He could see the material of the casing smoke just beneath Mannequin's eye, a dark patch revealing itself beneath. Mannequin's head fell, tipping over backwards to strike the ground, dangling from the chain, out of reach of the blade. Still holding Colin's wrist, the headless villain stood straight. He was toying with me. Mannequin wrenched his hand back, as if to make it clear that he had let him get that close, that Colin had never really stood a chance. Colin was pulled to one side, and he didn't have the strength in his midsection to keep from falling over. His knife clattered from his grip as he fell to the floor. The villain picked up the knife, examined it, then pressed the button to test it. The last thing Colin saw before darkness consumed his vision was the bastard using the weapon on the wall beside the window, dust billowing where it made contact. In the last seconds of consciousness, he heard Dragon's voice, as if from a faraway place. No, 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 Colin, stay awake! I need you! Her voice was the first thing he heard when he woke. Welcome back. I survived, his voice rasped. He'd had a tracheotomy. The only explanation for his throat being this sore would be having a tube rammed down it. Looking around, he saw a laptop propped up beside him and a get well card from Miss Militia. She must have put the laptop there when she left the card. Your heart stopped 9 times on the operating table, Dragon said. A lesser man wouldn't have made it. How? Artificial parts. I supplied your headquarters with a 3D scanner of my design weeks ago. I had them make the parts I specified. The on-site doctors kept you alive long enough for the scanner to make the necessary components, and they followed my instructions in installing them. Good girl, he told her, with genuine affection. I'm sorry about your face. He tried to raise his hand, but found it attached to IVs. He had to maneuver it carefully as he lifted it to his face so as not to tangle the wires. Almost seamlessly, his flesh transitioned into a smooth plastic and back to flesh again. It's all right, he said. Your new eye doesn't work. I think I know what's wrong with it, and I can get you something that will work. I just need time. You have better things to be doing. He coughed and regretted it as pain ripped through his throat with the movement of the muscles. His stomach felt strange. He started to speak, cleared his throat, then said, I think I could pull off an eye patch. The parts won't last. All of this is prototype stuff. Some of it I revised and invented while you were in surgery. They're temporary, but I can make better. I'm afraid you're going to need to go under the knife a few times. More than a few. That's fine. Thank you for all this. There was a pause. You're a fucking idiot, Colin. That was the stupidest fucking thing I've ever seen. He laughed. His breath caught with the pain each laugh produced, but he couldn't help it. Yeah, I hope that hurt. Wanted to provoke him, see if I couldn't find an opening. I repeat, stupidest fucking thing I've ever seen. Was going to kill me anyways. Was he? He could have killed you there. He didn't. He tried. No, Colin. Look. The laptop screen on the table beside him lit up and a browser page opened. An image loaded. A photo. Mannequin had left a message. 3 keys, again, on the edge of the desk. BR8. The 8, Colin supposed, was meant to stand in for a second B. BRB, an acronym used by countless denizens of the internet and innumerable cell phone texters. Be right back. Could be meant for you guys. Or it could be for you. He left me for dead. He couldn't really expect I'd survive. Dragon didn't reply. He thought of Mannequin. Despite the silence, despite the uncanny behavior and the dramatic self-mutilation, Mannequin was a brilliant man. A man who could have looked at the resources that were available in the building, who could have figured out Colin was in touch with Dragon, done just enough damage to push him to the brink of death. Shit. He probably could, Colin conceded. He stared at the photo for several long seconds, then turned away. Hoping to inject some levity into the grim conversation, he smiled and asked her, "What was this I heard when I was passing out? I need you?" The silence stretched on for so long that he knew he'd made some faux pas. He just wasn't sure what. Stupid. This was the kind of thing that had cost him his position, started the dominoes falling in such a way that they'd led him to being prisoner in that room, led to him being an easy target for Mannequin, to him being here, in this bed. Never knowing what to say, or how to say it, or who to say it to. He was about to apologize when Dragon said, "Those prosthetics I gave you? They were part of a bigger project, something I'd intended to use for myself." She was a cripple? He'd known she had survived Leviathan's attack on Newfoundland. Was it such a surprise that she'd gotten hurt then? It would explain her aversion to showing her face. One of the things she'd given him was a facial prosthetic. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know." "No, it's not that," she paused. "There's something you need to know about me." Interlude 11, Part 5. The high-pitched song of steel rang through the air as sword parried sword, struck shield, and fell to the ground. Somewhat less sweet were the guttural grunts and muffled slaps of flesh being battered and struck. A boot in the stomach, an elbow or fist striking a face. Hookwolf walked between the groups of his sparring recruits. They were tired, pushing themselves through their exhaustion. All wanted to be here. The training was too punishing for anyone who didn't. With small exceptions for eating and sleeping, their days were filled with exercise, hand-to-hand sparring, gun training, and practice with melee weapons. The main adversaries of the Chosen were mercenary soldiers, police, and trained heroes. Why should the standards of his Chosen be any lower than theirs? No, if his group was to represent the true Aryan warrior, they had to have higher standards. They had to be the best. It was that knowledge, that commitment that drove his trainees to give their all. Too many saw the Aryans as hate-mongers, failed to see the greater picture, the hope for raising humanity to a higher level. He stopped at one end of the room to watch their progress, watch for the ones who had the killer instinct he needed. Storm Tiger and Menja were at the other end of the room, looking for the same. Storm Tiger had cast off his mask and wore only face paint. He still walked a little stiffly from the gunshot wounds that he'd taken to his legs. Othala had attended to them over the past few weeks, would give him a half hour to an hour of regenerating ability each night until he was better, but knees were slow to heal. Menja wore her armor, her expression stern as she watched the form and habits of the combatants. Cricket sat in one corner of the room, typing on a laptop without looking at the screen, taking notes on the trainees. Hookwolf looked at Menja, and she raised one hand, 2 fingers extended. Signaling, she pointed to two of his 34 recruits, a bald man in peak physical condition and a 20-something girl with the ends of her hair in thin, bleached blonde braids, a little too much like cornrows for his liking. Maybe it was supposed to be ironic. He liked her first pick, though. He'd noticed the bald man. He'd committed their names to memory on first meeting them, but he'd forgotten some. He knew the man was Bradley, the girl was Leah or Laura or something like that. His own pick was a lean scrapper in his early 30s, Ralph. "Stop," he ordered. As one, his recruits pulled away from their fights and sheathed their blunted swords. Not all of them were able to stand straight. More than a few had bloody noses or black eyes. "You're 3 days into our week of training. If you're still here, you're doing us proud." He could see a few of them stand a little taller at that. Hookwolf had been a fighter before he'd been a fighter with powers. He had spent a great deal of time around athletes, knew all too well that just a little recognition and a little motivation could make a world of difference. Some of you have earned special attention. You fought harder, meaner, or better than the others. "Bradley, come here." The bald man approached. "Menja." Menja stepped through the gathered recruits to stand beside Bradley. "You two are going to fight. No weapons, no armor. Menja, you can use your powers, just a little." Menja smiled, then she grew 1.5 feet. Bradley stood at a height of just over 6 feet, but she still loomed head and shoulders above him. She unstrapped her armor and threw it aside. Bradley looked at Hookwolf, a flicker of concern crossing his features. "Part of the reason for this is that I want to see how you do against someone bigger than you," Hookwolf said. "You're tired. You've been training and sparring all day. Menja hasn't. Tough. If you're going to represent the Chosen as one of our elite, you're going to be expected to go up against capes. Things will be just as one-sided or worse." Bradley looked to his left, sizing up Menja. "Think you can fight her without embarrassing us? If you think you can do it, you might just have a place as one of our lieutenants, or as a leader of one of our war bands." "I'm no coward," Bradley replied. He turned to Menja and adopted a practiced fighting stance. Hookwolf watched with approval as the two squared off. It was clear from the start that Bradley was thrown off guard by how strong Menja was, and doubly apparent that he wasn't used to fighting someone with better reach or more power behind their hits. But he was trained, and he was familiar in how to use his body, and he adapted quickly. Bradley shifted to the defensive, and Menja struck with sharp kicks to his side and lunging steps forward to jab at his face. He timed a grab and quickly shifted to an arm lock, forcing Menja to bend over. For just a moment, it seemed like he had control of the situation, but Menja snapped back to her normal size, slipping her arm free, then struck at him, simultaneously growing. He was shoved to the ground. "Enough," Hookwolf said. It wouldn't do to let the man defeat Menja, and it was looking increasingly possible that he might. It would hurt her pride and weaken the position of his powered lieutenants in comparison to the unpowered ones. "Good man," he said from behind his mask. He offered the man a hand, and Bradley took it. "Well done. Welcome to the Chosen's elite." Bradley nodded and stood at attention. Hookwolf turned to the blonde girl. "Leah, was it?" She looked surprised to be picked, but she nodded. "Menja likes you. I don't. You get one chance to prove me wrong. Menja, who would you set her against?" There weren't many options. Storm Tiger couldn't walk, Menja wouldn't nominate herself, and it wouldn't just be a hassle to go get Rune, Othala, or Victor, but each of the three were either too powerful in a brawl or effectively powerless. That left Hookwolf himself, and Cricket, Menja said. Same reasoning. Leah's quick, Cricket's quicker. Cricket stood from her seat in the corner and limped forward. She'd refused the same help that Othala had granted Storm Tiger, both for the injury to her leg and the damage she'd taken to her vocal cords when she'd had her throat slashed in a time before he'd met her. It would have taken a few days at most to restore her to peak condition, but she valued her battle scars too highly. "Up for this, Leah?" Hookwolf smiled. Cricket's injury to her leg slowed her down some, but the young woman was anything but a pushover. Cricket reached to her side and picked up a small silver tube. She pressed it to the base of her throat, and her voice came out sounding distorted and digital. "Something's wrong." "With the fight?" Hookwolf asked, raising one eyebrow. Cricket opened her mouth and pressed the tube to her throat to reply, but didn't get a chance. The windows shattered with an explosive force, knocking the majority of the people in the room to the ground. Hookwolf was one of the few to remain standing, though he bent over as shards of glass tore through the layer of skin that covered his metal body. He took a moment to compose himself in the wake of the blast. His ears rang, and he bled from a dozen cuts, but he was more or less fine. His people were not. They groaned and screamed in pain, accompanied by the sound of car alarms going off outside. 2 trainees and one of his graduated chosen were dead. They'd been wearing glasses, and the glass had penetrated their eyes to tear into their brains. The others were all wounded to some degree or another. Some had been hit by the glass that flew from glasses others were wearing, others from the windows, and 1 or 2 others had patches of blood rapidly expanding around pockets where cell phones had been stowed. Why couldn't they have put the cell phones away before they started sparring? Leah lay dying, and Storm Tiger had one hand pressed to his throat, blood billowing from a cut that may or may not have nicked an artery. Hookwolf tapped into his core, the heart from which his metal sprouted inside his body. He could feel it start to churn with activity, and the metal he already had encasing each of his muscles began to stir. Soon it was lancing in and out of his pores, crisscrossing, some blades or needle points sliding against others with the sounds of whetted knives. In a few seconds, he had covered his body to protect himself from further attacks. "Shatterbird!" he roared, once he knew he was secure. There was no reply. Of course, she was attacking from a safe position. An attack from her meant an attack from the rest of the Slaughterhouse Nine. Daunting, but not impossible. He was virtually invincible in this form. That left few that could actively hurt him. Burnscar, the Siberian, Crawler. There was Hatchet Face, the bogeyman of capes. With the exception of Hatchet Face, the group wouldn't be able to do much harm to him unless he was forced to stay still. More troubling were the 9 he couldn't put down. The Siberian was untouchable, an immovable object, invincible in a way that even Alexandria wasn't. Even if he were capable of hurting Crawler, he wouldn't want to. Mannequin, he wasn't sure about. He knew the crazed tinker had encased himself in a nearly indestructible shell. As strong as Hookwolf was, he faced that distant possibility that any of these people could pin him down or set him up to be taken out by others. Who else? He racked his brain. Jack Slash was the brains and leader of the operation, not a threat unto himself. Shatterbird couldn't harm him, he was almost certain. Bonesaw. She was the wild card, the most unpredictable element in terms of what she could bring to the table. So often the case with tinkers. He strode across the room to the windows and gazed out at the city blocks surrounding the home base of the Chosen. Glass was still raining down from the sky, glimmering in the orange-purple light of the setting sun. Every window in view was broken, empty of glass. Car windshields, streetlights, and signs had all been affected, and the surrounding surfaces of wood, metal, and fiberglass all bore the scuffs and gouges of the fragile shrapnel. Every piece of glass in the room suddenly stood on end, points facing upward. He gave it a moment of his attention, then turned to the world beyond the window, hoping for some glimpse of his adversaries, a clue about where they were. "Cricket," he called out. "You alive?" He heard a sound, movement, and turned. She was gingerly searching through the carpet of weaponized glass shards for her artificial larynx. She found it and pressed the cylinder to her throat. "Alive. You said something was wrong. What did you notice?" "Sound. The glass was singing. Still is." She pointed at one wall. Hookwolf followed the line to a building across the street and a little ways to one side. His ears were ringing, but he doubted that was it. It would be something subsonic that Cricket noticed with her power then. "You come with me then. Menja, Storm Tiger, I leave it to you to see to my Chosen. See if Othala is able to help." "On it," Menja said. Thin trails of blood ran down from the points where glass splinters had pierced her skin, but the damage hadn't gone any further. She stooped down and picked up Storm Tiger in her arms. Orders given, Hookwolf drew the majority of his flesh into a condensed point in his core, felt himself come alive as more metal spilled forth. Only his eyes remained where they were, set in recessed sockets, behind a screen of shifting blades. He was half blind until the movement of the blades hit a rhythm, moving fast enough that they zipped over the surface of his eye at speeds faster than an eye blink. He let himself fall from the third-floor window and hit the ground in a state that was more liquid than solid. Blades, spears, hooks, and other twisted metal shapes all pooled on the pavement, absorbing the impact. He pulled himself together in his favored quadruped form. Looking up to the window, he created a tall spear from between his shoulders. Cricket leaped out and caught the pole, slid down until she could hop off and land beside him, skidding on the glass-covered surface. She looked annoyed as she looked down at her shoes, raising one foot off the ground to investigate the underside. Glass had embedded in the soles. He would have told her to ignore it, but he couldn't speak. For that matter, neither could she. Cricket pointed, and he led the way with her following directly behind him. As he walked, he wasn't moving his limbs quite so much as it might appear at first glance. Instead, he extended one growth of metal as he retracted another, only generating the illusion. 100 new parts growing each second to suggest shifting musculature, a cohesive form when he was anything but. Only the core skeleton, the shafts of metal that formed the limbs from the shoulders or hips to his knees, actually moved without retracting or extending. Glass rose from the ground to fit together into a window that floated in the air, and he smashed through it with one of his forelimbs. Another barrier appeared, thicker, and he smashed that as well. The glass began to form into dozens, even hundreds of barriers. He quickly found one strike wasn't enough to clear the way. Through the mess of dozens of dirty and wet panes of glass, he saw her. Shatterbird, a sand nigger going by memory and the color of her exposed skin. The upper half of her head was covered in a helmet of colored glass, and her body was covered with a flowing garment made of tiny glass shards like scales. He rose onto 2 feet, standing straight, and reconfigured his arms. With spears as big around as telephone poles, he punched through 30 or 40 panes of glass all at once, then did the same with his opposite hand. It was slow progress, as the glass constantly reformed and pieced itself back together a few feet ahead of him, but he was closing in. She abruptly dropped the barriers and changed tactics. The majority of the glass in the area formed into one shape, a cone of solid glass, pointing towards the center of the purple-red sky, 2.5 stories tall. Raising one hand, she shot it straight up into the sky above, until it was just a speck. Hookwolf lunged for her, only to find that the residual glass that remained on the ground was denying him traction. His metal claws failed to find grip, failed to crack the glass, even with the heavy impacts and his impressive weight. Closing the distance proved slower than he'd hoped. The massive spike of glass plummeted from the sky. He knew it was coming, had kept an eye out for it, and timed a leap to coincide with its descent. No use. It veered unerringly for him, speared into him with enough force that it nearly sheared him in half. Cricket uttered a strangled scream as she got hit by the fallout of glass shards and scraps of metal. "Stand," Shatterbird said. Her voice held traces of a British accent, and her body language and the crisp enunciation made her sound imperious, upper class. "I know you survived." Hookwolf struggled to pull himself together. He used hooks to pull the metal back towards his core, where it could be reabsorbed, recycled. It didn't take much of his reserve of internal energy to create and move the metal, but it took some, and he'd rather not run out. It was a risk, he knew, but he needed a few moments to pull himself together and rebuild his body. He let his head and upper chest emerge from the core, taking form in the hollow metal head of his canid form. "What do you people want?" he asked. "Person. Singular. I am the only member of my group here," Shatterbird informed him. "Arrogant. You can be arrogant when you're strong enough. You should know, Hookwolf. You here to make trouble?" She shook her head, her helmet sparkling in the light cast by the setting sun. "I'm the Nine's primary recruiter. I have an eye for people who can thrive among us, and I have brought more than 5 individuals on board. I thought long and hard before settling on you. I am not about to let you turn me down." So that was why she hadn't hit the entire city with the blast, shattering the glass and maiming or killing hundreds. She hadn't wanted to kill any prospective members, wanted to reserve her power for when it would be most dramatic. "I'm fine where I am. This isn't a request. Is that so? You gonna make me? He was nearly restored. He could fight now if he needed to. Yes, I know who you are, Hookwolf. I spent some time researching your history. Not that interesting. I beg to differ. You ally with the Aryan groups. Run one, but your motivations seem to be different. I have guesses as to why, but I'd rather you tell me. Tell you? Why should I? I think we're done here. Shatterbird raised one hand, then frowned, her lips pursing together. Cricket climbed to her feet. She was bleeding badly where she had exposed skin, and chunks of glass were partially buried in her arms and legs. There was the quiet rasp of her laughter. Pride goeth before the fall, Hookwolf said, striding towards his enemy. Seems as though Cricket can use her subsonics to cancel you out. Seems so, Shatterbird answered, rapidly backing up to maintain some distance from Hookwolf. And here I was thinking you'd won the lottery with powers. Incredible range, fine control, devastating force, versatility, and all it takes is the right noise and it all falls apart? Guess the men who bought my power should ask for a refund. No, not interested in being conned into a game of 20 questions to figure out what you're talking about. Not giving you a chance to figure a way out. He punched one of his massive spears at her, and she threw herself to the ground, rolling beneath the impaling weapon. As she stood, she drew a gun from the folds of her glittering dress. She fired between Hookwolf's legs at Cricket, the noise of the shots ringing through the air. Hookwolf didn't even need to look. He laughed. No, afraid my lieutenant is a little too fast for you. Look out, Cricket said from behind him, the artificial sound of her voice detracting from the inflection and urgency. A tide of glass slammed into him. Standing on only two limbs, his balance suffered, and he wasn't able to keep from being pushed onto his side. Wasn't aiming at her, Shatterbird said. She fired several more shots, simultaneously releasing a shard of glass from her free hand. Hookwolf turned, saw Cricket clutching her throat. She dodged the bullets, but Shatterbird had controlled the flight of the glass shard she shot at Cricket much in the same way she'd controlled the descent of the massive spike of glass. It had struck its target, just needed to break her concentration. Cricket collapsed, large quantities of blood spilling through her fingers and around her hands where they clutched her throat. Now it's just you and me, Shatterbird said. She dusted herself off, not giving any concern to the sharp edges of the glass shards that made up her garment. We talk. I think I'll kill you instead, Hookwolf growled. What's the rush? In fact, any moment we delay, you have a chance of reinforcements arriving. Your Storm Tiger, your Othala, your Menja, they could all do a little something to assist you. It's in your advantage for us to delay the fight. Except I'm more than capable of putting you down myself. Perhaps. He adjusted his form, dropping to 4 legs once more. The aesthetic suffered, but he created 2 needle-tipped limbs at his shoulders, poised like scorpions' tails. Ah, that's much better, she said, but you're still too attached to conventional forms. Why have legs at all? They're enough. He pounced. She leaped to one side and almost glided to a position across the street. She was using the glass of her costume to levitate herself. From her new vantage point, she told him, I did say I had my suspicions about your motivations. I think I've come to understand you. Jack encourages this, you know. Understanding our targets, be they recruits or victims. You learn a lot being with him. I believe you, Hookwolf, are a born warrior. He pounced once more, driving both foreclaws at her and following up with 2 quick jabs with his needle-tipped limbs. She dodged all 3 hits, then swept a carpet of glass beneath him as he pounced quickly after her. He landed and skidded on the surface like one might with a carpet of marbles falling onto one side, and she threw a tidal wave of glass shards at him, driving him across the street to distance him once more. He stopped to draw his head and upper body back into the core. The wave of glass had come too close to penetrating the head of his form and cutting his flesh. It was dangerously vulnerable. A warrior at heart, she'd said. He'd thought, sometimes, that he was born at the wrong time. Had he been born in Rome's heyday, the Crusades, or any of the great wars, in eras where martial pride and strength were valued, he thought he might have been a great person, a soldier feared on the battlefield. He would have relished that life. Here now? Even with powers, he wasn't so notable. People with a tendency for violence and a thirst for blood just didn't thrive. What I can't figure out. She paused to throw herself up to the top of a 4-story building, then raised her voice to be heard on the ground, is what you're doing with these chosen of yours. He couldn't speak to answer her, and only climbed the building's face. He was 3/4 of the way up when she leaped down, soaring toward the sidewalk on the opposite side of the street, always keeping her distance. A gale caught her, and her lateral movement stopped. As wind twisted around her, she was driven down into the street, hard. Hookwolf would have laughed if he could. He looked at his headquarters and saw Storm Tiger crouching by the front door, clutching a blood-soaked rag to his throat. Storm Tiger wouldn't interfere where it counted, but he would give Hookwolf the opportunity to confront his opponent. He adjusted his position and fell to the street next to Shatterbird. She held one leg while laying on her back. She'd fallen badly. Stalking towards her, he heard she was still talking. You call them Fenrir's chosen. I'm a scholar, believe it or not. I know Fenrir was one of the beasts that brings about Ragnarok, the death of the gods. Fenrir was the beast who slew Odin, Allfather, king of the gods. Fenrir was a wolf, too coincidental for that to be an accident on your part. He stirred the blades that made up his form, pushing himself to be bigger, more dangerous as he closed the distance. A sword age, an axe age, a wind age, a wolf age, a world where none have mercy. I can believe this is your goal, your ultimate objective. Do you crave to reduce this city to darkness, blood, and ash so that only the strong will survive? Do you tell your followers that it is only the pure will rise to the top in the New World Order? He set one clawed foot down on her. He could feel some blades on the underside of his foot bite into her flesh. She didn't fight him or resist. Join us, she said, her voice strained. He formed a head and mouth. His voice echoed from within his metal skull. You describe me as a warrior. Why would I join petty killers? She shifted her position, huffing out sentences between gasps of pain. Only a matter of scale. Need more like you in our number, frontline combatants, capable of carving murder through the ranks of the innocent, through our enemies. We could be great warriors. Not interested. We could create your Ragnarok more than any number of chosen. They are my people. I won't turn my back on them. Then kill me. A thin smile crossed her face, though her expression was drawn with pain. When she spoke, it was in more short sentences. But know that your dream is over, unless you come with us. Once nominated, you'll be tested, by others, whether willing or not. I have left notes, urging them to kill your soldiers, to raise any place you might call home, to bestow fates worse than death. He raised his claw from her. She was bleeding from wounds in her stomach and pelvis. He'd had a hard enough time killing this one. If the other 7 arrived, no, he wouldn't be able to stop them alone, and his lieutenants were not strong enough to hold them off. And you won't rescind these orders and requests? I will. If you join, you give me your word, I leave. You will be tested. Your people left alone. When the test is done, you're either dead or one of us. What is it you want? Make history, names in books, taught to school children for years, centuries. Our goals, she winced, pressed one hand to her stomach, coincide. He pondered for a few moments. Could they escape? No. You didn't escape the 9. He'd already considered fighting, but that option was out. There was a possibility he could lay a trap for them, or buy time for his people to escape. Fine. Another thin smile crossed her face. She used her power to raise herself to a standing position, her toes only barely touching the ground. So loyal. But I won't forget what you've already done. If you survive, I will wait for the right time and place, and I will kill you. One day. Already thinking like one of us, rest assured. I will survive. Glass drifted towards her to fill the injuries, cracking in the right spots so each fragment fit the wounds perfectly. The smallest particles of glass, a fine cloud of dust, flowed forth to fill the gaps. Then she rose into the sky. Hookwolf signaled for Storm Tiger to hold his fire. He wasn't going to accept this. They'd insulted him, hurt his people. They wanted to subvert his mission and twist it to their own ends? No. His face twisted into a scowl as he looked over the glass-strewn street and at Cricket's prone form. He'd told Shatterbird he'd kill her sometime in the future, had hopefully led her to expect something further down the line. No, he would go through the motions of their test, even join them for the short term. But he'd kill them sooner than later. Before they left the city, he looked at his people, saw Othala hurrying over to Cricket's side to grant the young woman regenerating abilities. Rune was hurt, the right side of her face torn up, healed only enough to close the cuts and stop the worst of the bleeding. Probably Othala. Everyone else was injured to some degree, many gravely. He'd need help from elsewhere. Interlude 11, Part 6. If each of the tens of trillions of universes were like pictures, then they were organized into a mosaic, constantly rearranging itself and shuffling. Taken in as a whole, it was a muddle. Depending on how it shuffled, sometimes patterns emerged. A predominant color, perhaps, or lots of scenes that were blurs of motion and activity. But there was more to it. There were faint sounds, for one thing, and they weren't just two-dimensional, just the opposite. They were each a fully realized world, and each was continuous, like a slideshow or film reel that extended vast distances forward and backward from any of the scenes of focus. Things got even more complicated when each of the slideshow reels forked out and branched as they moved further away. The only thing stopping them were the terminus points. The first terminus wasn't complicated: the now, the present. It moved inexorably, steadily forward, consuming the individual realities as they ceased to be the future and became the now. The other terminus was somewhat more ominous. Every branch ended at some point, some sooner than others. Dinah Alcott knew that those branches were ones where she had died. Right now, there were a lot of them, more coming into view with every passing second. Almost all of the images in the mosaic were either black or crimson. Either the lights were on and everything was covered in blood, or they were off and she was effectively blind. She concentrated, and the mosaic organized into two portions, one slightly larger than the other. In one half, that death terminus came very soon. In the other, it was some distance off. She judged the size of the individual parts, and the number snapped into her head. 43.034851274405795% chance she would die in the next 30 minutes. The chance was steadily ticking upward with each passing second, with possible realities becoming impossible and fading from her view, or being replaced with other possibilities, effectively shifting over to the other side. Anxiety crept up on her. She wanted her candy, to take the edge off, to help clarify her thoughts. She knocked on the door to her room. She heard Coyle say something on the other side and tested the knob. Finding it unlocked, she stepped through. Coyle sat at his desk, on the phone. She didn't want to talk to him, but she wanted to die less. "It's unfortunate," Coyle was saying. "Step up recon. Call in a secondary team to ensure 24/7 surveillance. We'll want a replacement for our Leah the moment they start recruiting again." "Yes, good. Let me know." He hung up. "Coyle? What is it, pet?" 44.20383% chance I die in the next half hour. He stood from his desk. "How?" "Blood or darkness. Don't know." "The chance I die in the next 30 minutes?" She thought, and felt the mosaic shift into a new configuration. Coyle's face predominated each tiny scene, active, speaking and alive in some, unmoving or dead in the others. 42.709% for the worlds where I don't die. Don't know about the worlds where I die first. "And say, Mr. Pitter, the chance he dies?" 40 point. She stopped as Coyle raised a hand. "So whatever it is, it happens here and involves everyone here. Chance of survival if we leave?" 10.664. "No. Chance the average person in the city lives if we leave?" 99 point. "So we're targets. It's not an attack on the city. If we mobilize the squads to one decimal place?" 48.1% chance I survive, 49.9% chance you survive. "No difference. Worse, if anything," he said. She nodded, and he rubbed his chin, thinking. Time was running out. She fidgeted. "I need some candy, please." "No, pet," Coyle said. "I need you focused." "What?" She interrupted him, which always she tried to avoid doing, but she was feeling desperate. "Please. I've been using my power a lot. I'm going to get a bad headache, and then I won't be useful to you." "No," he said, with more ferocity than she had expected. "Pitter isn't here to administer it. and won't be until this situation is over. Listen, chance that we survive Crawler's attack if my soldiers use the laser attachments I've provided? The purple beams? Crawler? It took her a second to get her mental footing. Coil was using his power. She wasn't sure how it worked, but she could always tell when he was doing it, because the numbers always started changing all at once, and he knew things he couldn't. He'd know about things and numbers she might have told him, except she didn't remember telling him. 39.1. If I deploy the travelers that are on site at the moment? 30 point. He pushed his monitor off his desk in a fit of anger. It crashed to the floor, pieces of screen rolling and sliding onto the rug at one end of the room. Striding around the desk, he seized her by the arm and pulled her out of his office. "Candy, please," she said, whispering, "no." Gripping her wrist so hard it hurt, he drew her into the main area of his underground complex. "Get battle ready," Coyle shouted. It was so out of character for him to shout. "Threat incoming." The soldiers that were at ease in the lower area of the base jumped to action, grabbing weapons and protective wear. It wasn't going to make a difference. The numbers weren't changing enough. But he was already upset, so she didn't tell him that. Trickster, Oliver, and Sundancer appeared, running along the metal catwalk. Sundancer had her mask off, and her permed blonde hair was damp against her scalp with sweat. Oliver was in casual clothing, like Trickster. He was good-looking, his features chiseled, athletically built. Trickster wasn't. He had a hook nose and long hair that didn't suit him, but she knew he was smart, and she would have guessed it even if she didn't know, just going by the way he looked at stuff. "What's going on?" Trickster asked. "My pet has graciously informed us that Crawler of the Slaughterhouse 9 is less than 30 minutes away from entering this complex and murdering us all. Suggestions outside of the obvious would be appreciated." "Trickster and I could go and try to stop him," Sundancer suggested. "Outside of the obvious, Sundancer. I've asked my pet. You try that and we're all more likely to die." "Why?" "He's a regenerator," Coyle answered, sounding irritated at having to explain, "and he regenerates exceedingly quickly. More to the point, he has the added advantage that any part that grows back is stronger than it was before, typically with extra features, growths, and increased durability to render him more resistant to whatever hurt him or give him other capabilities. These adjustments are not only permanent, but he's been working on it for some time." Trickster added, "I read up on these guys after you mentioned them the other night. Crawler eventually becomes immune to whatever was hurting him, and he's that much less human afterward. He wants to get hurt, wants to further his transformation like a crazed masochist or someone with a death wish, throws himself into suicidal situations and then comes out stronger, which may be why he's here. The soldiers?" Coyle shook his head. "He's immune to conventional ammunition and explosives, and most likely to most unconventional forms of ammunition and explosives as well. The laser attachments might have some small effect, but not enough to draw him here. Which makes me wonder all of a sudden how he found us," Trickster added. Coyle shook his head. "One thing at a time. If he is here because he's seeking someone who could harm him, the only individuals on site who would be capable are Sundancer and your Noelle." That gave the three teenagers pause. "Noelle? But who even knows about Noelle, except—" Coyle raised his hand to silence Trickster. "Pet, the chance that Crawler would seek out Noelle first, given the opportunity." She felt the images filter out until she was looking at a pattern of scenarios. The vague shape of the hulking figure, the open vault door. The images snapped into two groups, one vastly larger than the other. 93.4%. "Shit," Trickster swore. "That's why he's here. Just like Leviathan, Crawler's coming after her? I find every piece of evidence we gather only supports our working theory on your teammate," Coyle said. He turned to Dinah. "The chance of survival if we were to give him what he wanted? Give him access to Noelle?" "Hey, no," Trickster said. 81.9% chance we survive the next hour." "A start," Coyle noted. Something about the image bothered her. She pushed forward, seeing the possible realities that unfolded after that. Very, very few extended any meaningful distance into the future. 6% chance we survive the next 5 hours. Coyle stopped, then sighed. "Thank you, Pet, for clarifying that." She nodded. "Awesome," Trickster responded. his voice thick with sarcasm. With a more serious tone and expression, he said, "Let's not give him access to Noel. Agreed?" "Agreed," Coyle conceded. "Any further ideas?" "Time's running out." She looked at the numbers for herself, even though she felt the initial throbbing pains at the base of her skull that foretold the encroaching headaches. 53.8% chance I die in the next 30 minutes. "Pet," Coyle said. What she didn't get from his tone, she grasped from the vague images she saw of her most immediate possible futures. "No," she pleaded before he'd even told her what he wanted. "It's necessary. I want you to look at a future where we survived, and I want you to tell us what happened." "No. Please," she begged. "Now, Pet, why is she so against this?" Trickster asked. "Headaches," Dinah answered, pressing her hands to her head. "It breaks my power. It takes days, sometimes weeks, before everything is sorted out and working again. Headaches the entire time until everything is sorted out. Worse headaches if I try to get numbers in the meantime. Have to be careful, can't muddle things up, can't lie about the numbers, can't look at what happens, or it just becomes chaos. Safer to keep a distance, to make and follow rules. Safer to just ask the questions and let things fall into place." "We don't have time to play 20 questions," Coyle said. "Would you rather die? Would she?" She wasn't sure. Death was bad, but at least then she'd go on to the afterlife. To heaven, she hoped. Finding an answer and surviving would mean days and weeks of absolute hell, of constant pain and not being able to use her power. "Pet," Coyle said when she didn't give him an immediate response, "do it now, or you won't get any more candy for a long while." She could see those futures unfolding. He would. She could see the pain and the sickness she experienced, the full brunt of her power without her candy to take the edges off, complete with all of the details she didn't want. Worst of all were the feedback loops. To go through withdrawal from the drugs, from her candy, while simultaneously being able to see and experience echoes of the future moments where she was suffering much the same way. It was a massive increase in the pain and being sick, and mood swings and insomnia, and feeling numb and skin-crawling hallucinations. There was no limit to these echoes, the feedback from her futures. It would never kill her, knock her out, or put her in a coma, no matter how much she might want it to. She had come close to experiencing it once, early on in her captivity. Never again. She would obey Coyle in everything he asked for before she risked that happening again. "Okay," she murmured. She picked out one of the paths where they survived. Even looking too closely at it made her head throb, like it was in a massive vice and someone had just cranked it a fraction tighter. Some of the possible worlds around the fringes of her consciousness disintegrated into a mess of disordered scenes as she pushed forward. The scenes and images of the less possible worlds flew around her mind like razor-sharp leaves in a gale, cutting at everything they touched. "It hurts. Now, Pet, as quickly as you can." He didn't know. It was something else, like trying to will herself to stick a hot poker in her body, in her brain, knowing it would remain there and burn her for weeks before it cooled. But she did it, because as much as it would hurt more if she didn't get her candy. If Crawler got his hands on her, it wouldn't hurt at all after those first few moments of pain, but that was bad too. It meant dying. She focused hard on that scene, taking it from an image small and vague enough that it could have fit on the end of a pencil to something full size. Her head exploded with pain. She caught fragmentary images as she felt herself double over and heave the contents of her stomach onto the metal catwalk and Sundancer's legs and feet. Sundancer could have yelled, but she didn't. Instead, she fell to her knees and grabbed Dinah by the shoulders to steady her. It was just in time because Dinah felt fireworks erupt in her brain, felt her body go spastic. Too much, too fast. The image was overly sharp and detailed, overwhelming her senses, shredding all sense of time and present. It was long moments before she could even piece together what the others were saying and doing. She was lying down, her head on Sundancer's lap, a cold cloth against her forehead. Oliver leaned next to her, holding a bowl of cold water. "Running out of time," Trickster shouted. Coyle stood just behind Trickster, arms folded, staring out over the railing at his underground base. "Give her a moment," Sundancer said. "Whatever that was, it just knocked the poor kid out. That deadline she gave us? It's here." Now. I know, but pressuring her won't help anything. A smell hit her, like the bitterest black chocolate in the world and overly strong coffee, the odor so thick on the air that she could taste it. With her already upset stomach, it made her want to retch. Smells bad, she said. Make the smell go away. She's conscious. Is this smell a clue? Trickster turned. No, it's a symptom, Coil answered him, not turning to look at her or them. She may be dizzy, dazed, or she may rub or scratch at herself until she fully recovers. Don't let her scratch her corneas or rub herself until she bleeds. Dinah tried to recall what she'd seen. Darkness. You mentioned that earlier, Pet. We were in the dark, and it smelled like meat. It smelled like sweat, too. And we were all pressed in close together. Where? Coyle asked. There was a metal door in front of us. Big, the vault door downstairs. Noelle's room, Trickster said, an instant before Dinah put the pieces together. How many of us, Pet? Everyone here was there. She looked towards the soldiers. Is she in there? She was, yes. Coyle turned and swept her up in his arms. Her skin crawled at the contact of her body against his. She didn't say or do anything about it, in part because she wasn't able, too sick, hurting too much. The other reason was because she had seen the numbers shift each time she flinched away from his touch or made her disgust known. Little differences. He was angrier with her, more curt, if she pulled away, if she complained about it. There was safety in the numbers, in following the rules she set on herself. It kept her power in order. It ensured Coyle was tolerant with her, and it meant she didn't have to go without her candy for even a short time. Coyle took the stairs 2 at a time as he descended to the ground floor. Trickster, Oliver and Sundancer hurrying after him. You, Coyle called out, not even bothering to recall the employee's name. The vault door. Open it. Squad leaders, organize your groups. There was a faint crash in the distance, and a vibration rippled through the complex. Pet, the chance that Crawler kills us now that we've undertaken this route? I don't. I can't. Her head hurt so much. Try. And in his hard tone, she heard the unspoken threat of having her candy taken away. She did. The scenes had no order to them. They were all jumbled, and trying to pull some semblance of order and sense into them was like thrusting her hands into fire and razor blades, thrusting her mind into fire and razor blades. A long groan of pain was drawn from her throat, and the strength went out of her body. You're killing her, Sundancer gasped. No, Coyle said as if from a place far away. I've had her use her power to check. This may be miserable for her, but she can't die from it. Coyle touching her, that overpowering phantom smell, the fear, the nausea. I need to barf. Coyle set her down and held her by the wrists as she leaned forward to cough up mouthfuls of bile. Her stomach was already empty of food. The number, Pet? Sundancer bent down to hold her so her shoulders weren't being twisted with her arms held behind her by Coyle. 3.1%, Dinah gasped out. Reassuring, Coyle said. The vault door opened before them. Trickster, would you announce our imminent arrival to Noelle? Yeah, Trickster sighed. Fuck, I hate to do this, but can I get a number? Trickster, Sundancer admonished him, sounding horrified. You can see how much pain it's causing her. It's important, kid. What's the chance that Noelle kills us? There was another series of crashes. Closer. Dinah shook her head. Please, I just want to put everything back together. Every time I use my power, it all falls apart and it hurts. Pet, it's the last question we'll ask you tonight. I promise, Coyle said. So she did. She reached for the number. It can't kill me. It doesn't do permanent damage. It just hurts. It's my brain telling me my power shouldn't be used to find answers like that. The words she used to convince herself did little to soften the pain that came with digging for a number once more. She screamed, and tears flowed down her face as she sank into Sundancer's arms, screwing her eyes shut. 9.8%, she managed. Was she being carried? They were venturing inside, past the first of the 2 heavy vault doors. How much time had just passed? Where was Trickster? That's good information to have, Pet, Coyle said from somewhere near her. Squad leaders, as you gather inside the containment room, I want you organizing your troops into ranks, your backs to the door. Weapons need to be locked, loaded, and ready to fire. Be sure to equip the laser attachments and battery packs. Don't venture any further than 10 paces inside. There were affirmative responses. Dinah could hear guns cocking. Another crash, the closest yet. The sound of rubble and concrete falling echoed through the underground complex. "He's here," Coyle said. "Last people inside, hurry. Close the first door." Dinah opened her eyes. They were in a concrete room with steel girders at set intervals, as if forming a cage against the inside of the room. It smelled like meat that had gone bad. The second vault door slowly swung closed as the last few stragglers slipped through the gap. Employees, technicians, people in suits, some soldiers. They packed in close at the end of the room closest to the door, their bodies pressing against her. 3/5 of the chamber were left unoccupied. And on the other side of the room, darkness. Trickster was emerging. "How is she?" Coyle asked. "Scared. Hungry. She said she didn't get her meal tonight," Trickster answered, his voice quiet. Coyle folded his arms. "She did. I personally observed the delivery. I suspect she's needing more food as of late. Unfortunate we find this out now. She asked me to turn out the lights on this end of her room. Said it would be easier if she can't see us." "Do it," Coyle ordered. He strode over to one of his squad captains and spoke in the man's ear. Dinah thought she might have overheard something about night vision goggles. She closed her eyes, as if it could help shut out the pain that continued to tear through her skull. The pink of the light shining through her eyelids turned to black as the lights went out. "I'm sorry," a girl's voice whispered in Dinah's ear. "Sundancer?" Dinah tried to answer, but her voice came out in a croak. "I'd help you if I could, but I can't. You understand?" Sundancer whispered to her. She had her arms around Dinah. She smelled like barf, but that was Dina's fault. "It's not just that my friends and I are in a bad spot, or having to help Noelle, or even that I don't think I could save you on my own. We made a promise to each other when everything began. Fuck, it sounds so stupid, sounds so lame, when I say it like that." There was a crash nearby, the sound of metal on metal. Then a massive impact against the vault door made the room shudder. Sundancer kept talking, as if oblivious to the ongoing attack. "When you've been through hell and back again with a group of people, when you've all lost everything, and you collectively stand to lose more, I don't even know what I'm saying. Maybe there's no justification for letting you go through what you are. They're all I've got. I'm sorry." Dinah reached up and fumbled around until she found Sundancer's hand. She didn't have a response. Couldn't speak if she'd been able to think of what to say. She just held the hand tight. A series of hits collided with the metal door. A roar rattled through the air, painfully loud, despite the muffling effect of the intervening wall. It was a roar heavy with frustration and anger. There was the sound of guns cocking. She almost missed it in the midst of the steady, relentless crashes that came from the metal door. "I'm so hungry," a girl's voice echoed through the chamber. "She's close." "I know, Noelle," Trickster answered. "Just a little while. Let's go back to the other side, away from these people." Noelle sounded like someone who was very, very tired. Can't wait at all these days. I can smell them." She wants food as badly as I want my candy, Dinah thought. The difference is that she can and will take what she wants, even if it means eating one of us. I don't have that power. God, her head hurt. Worse, she knew this was the calm before the storm. Her head would hurt more with every passing hour until she wanted to die. "You can hold on," Trickster said, his voice gentle. "You don't want to come any closer than that. You know what your power does. None of us want that." "No. And these guys, as good as they are, I can't be positive that one of them won't shoot you in a moment of panic. We don't want that either. I'd live. Don't want to, but I'd live." "You would. But would I? Would Oliver and Marissa if you went berserk? They're in here too." Sundancer spoke up, calling out, "Remember the promise we made together." Noelle didn't reply. The silence lingered, punctuated by the heavy blows on the metal door, echoing through the concrete chamber. "Come on, Noelle. Let's go back before you or someone else here does something they'll regret," Trickster urged. The banging continued. "Come with me, Kraus. We can talk alone." "That sounds good," Trickster said. Dinah felt the tension in the room ease. The pain in her skull didn't get any better. She set about the tedious task of trying to reorganize the images in her head, building a house of cards in an unpredictable wind. Every time the numbers changed, what she'd started to sort out fell apart. She'd have to wait until a period of calm before she made any real headway. The passage of time would help as well. Then it wouldn't be so painful to use her ability. She got caught up in the painstaking operation, and it was some time before she realized the banging had stopped. Still, the gathered people in the room waited, just in case Crawler was bluffing them, waiting until they opened the door. Long minutes passed before Coil gave the order. Dinah was blind, her power too fragile and painful to use, so she couldn't see the future that awaited them outside the door. Her heart pounded in her throat as the door was opened. The first squads moved out, fanning through the complex to find if Crawler was lurking in some corner of the underground base. They returned and gave the all clear. Emerging from the gloom, she squinted in the face of the fluorescent lights. Claw marks gouged the outside of the solid steel of the vault door, each at least half a foot deep. The catwalk had been torn down at one side of the complex, and innumerable boxes of weapons and supplies had been crushed or scattered across the floor. "Candy?" she asked. "My head hurts." "You can have your candy, pet. Go to your room. I'll call Pitter in and send him to you." With her armed escort, she headed to her room. She collapsed gratefully on her bed. She knew she'd regret it, but she used her power. She had to know. It would be one more use to hold her over, and she would stop using her power for the next few days at least. Weeks, if Coil let her. She clutched her covers and bit her pillow as her head erupted with pain. More than half of the groundwork she'd so carefully laid in place over the past hour fell apart as she pulled the scenes into two groups. Minutes passed before she had her number. 31.6%. More than 4% higher than it had been yesterday. 31.6% chance she'd get to go home someday.